The mountainous landscape of Wales provided both sanctuary and challenge for its earliest inhabitants, shaping a distinct culture that would resist foreign domination for centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals human presence in Wales stretching back to the Paleolithic period, but the foundations of recognisably Welsh identity emerged during the Iron Age, with the arrival and establishment of Celtic tribes whose descendants would forge the Welsh nation. The Celtic Britons who settled Wales between 800 and 100 BC brought with them sophisticated metalworking techniques, complex social structures, and spiritual practices centred around natural landscapes. These migrants did not arrive as a single wave, but rather as successive groups of families and clans, establishing territories that reflected both geographical boundaries and tribal affiliations. The process of settlement involved displacing or assimilating earlier Bronze Age populations, creating a cultural fusion that would characterise Welsh society for generations. 3 major tribal confederations dominated Wales during the late Iron Age. The Silures controlled the southeastern regions, establishing their power base in what would later become Monmouthshire and Glamorgan. Archaeological excavations at sites like Llanmylin Wood reveal their hill fort settlements, characterised by multiple defensive ramparts and evidence of iron production. The Silures developed a reputation as fierce warriors, their society organised around a warrior elite who controlled trade routes and agricultural production. Their settlements featured roundhouses constructed with stone foundations and timber superstructures, surrounded by storage pits for grain and workshops for metalworking. The Ordovikers held sway over the mountainous interior and northern regions, their territory encompassing modern Snowdonia and extending eastward into the Welsh Marches. Their name, possibly meaning hammer fighters, reflected their martial culture adapted to the challenging terrain of their homeland. The Ordovices constructed impressive hill forts on elevated positions, taking advantage of natural defensive features. At sites like Tre'r Ceri on the Llyn Peninsula, massive stone walls enclosed clusters of roundhouses that could shelter entire communities during times of conflict. The tribe's economy relied heavily on livestock, particularly cattle and sheep suited to the upland environment, supplemented by limited agriculture and valley floors. The Demeti occupied the southwestern peninsula, the territory corresponding roughly to modern Pembrokeshire and parts of Carmarthenshire. Unlike their more militaristic neighbours, the Demeti developed a society focused on maritime activities and trade. Their coastal location provided access to Irish sea trading networks, and archaeological evidence suggests regular contact with Ireland and Cornwall. The tribe's settlements often featured distinctive souterrains, underground storage chambers lined with stone slabs, indicating sophisticated food preservation techniques necessary for supporting coastal communities. These tribal societies operated according to complex hierarchical structures, headed by kings or chieftains who derived authority from both martial prowess and spiritual legitimacy. Warriors formed the elite class, distinguished by their weapons, ornate metalwork, and participation in cattle raids that served both economic and social functions. Below the warriors, free farmers worked land held by tribal custom, while skilled craftsmen, smiths, potters and jewellers enjoyed elevated status due to their specialised knowledge. At the bottom of the social order, slaves captured in warfare or born into bondage performed agricultural labour and domestic tasks. Celtic religion permeated every aspect of tribal life, with druids serving as priests, judges, teachers, and repositories of oral tradition. These learned men underwent decades of training, memorising vast amounts of genealogical, legal, and religious knowledge. Sacred groves, springs, and hilltops served as centres of worship where the tribes made offerings to gods associated with war, fertility, and the natural world. The island of Anglesey emerged as a particularly important druidic centre, its isolation and fertile soil making it both spiritually significant and economically valuable. The Roman conquest of Wales began not as a planned campaign but as a consequence of broader imperial expansion into Britain following Claudius's invasion in 43 AD. Initial Roman objectives focused on securing the lowland areas of southern and eastern Britain, but the unconquered Welsh tribes posed a constant threat to Roman settlements and trade routes. Refugee warriors from defeated tribes in England fled westward, swelling the ranks of Welsh resistance and bringing knowledge of Roman military tactics. Governor Publius Ostorius Scapula initiated the first serious Roman attempts to subdue Wales around 48 AD. Scapula recognised that the Welsh tribes' mountainous terrain and guerrilla warfare tactics required different strategies than those employed in the conquest of Gaul or the lowland areas of Britain. His forces faced the challenge of fighting an enemy who could disappear into familiar hills and valleys, striking Roman columns and supply trains before melting away into the landscape. The Roman advance met its first major test against Caratacus, a Catuvellauni prince who had fled westward after the fall of his brother's kingdom in southeastern England. Caratacus possessed intimate knowledge of Roman military capabilities, having fought against them for nearly a decade. He understood that traditional Celtic tactics, mass charges by individual warriors seeking personal glory, would prove ineffective against disciplined Roman formations. Instead, he advocated for coordinated resistance using the terrain to negate Roman advantages in equipment and training. Caratacus initially sought refuge among the Silures, whose territory provided excellent defensive positions in the Welsh valleys. The tribe's warriors, already renowned for their ferocity, embraced the exiled prince's leadership and his promise of driving the Romans from Britain entirely. Under Caratacus's direction, the Silures abandoned their hill forts and adopted mobile warfare, striking Roman patrols and supply convoys before retreating into the forests and mountains, where legionary formations could not effectively pursue them. The conflict intensified when Caratacus convinced the Ordovices to join the resistance. The northern tribes' knowledge of mountain warfare complemented Silurian tactics, creating a coordinated threat across much of unconquered Wales. Roman sources describe ambushes in narrow valleys where entire centuries could be destroyed by rolling boulders and arrow fire from concealed positions. The legions found themselves fighting an enemy who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, never offering the decisive battle that Roman tactics were designed to win. Scapula's response involved systematic devastation of tribal territories, burning settlements and crops to deny the resistance supplies and shelter. Roman engineers constructed a network of roads and fortified camps, gradually tightening control over strategic valleys and river crossings. The governor's forces built temporary camps every few miles along their routes of advance, creating secure bases for further operations while denying the Welsh freedom of movement in their own territories. The decisive confrontation came in 51 AD when Caratacus, pressed by Roman advances from multiple directions, chose to make his stand in Ordovician territory. The exact location remains debated by historians, but the battle likely occurred in the valleys of central Wales, where the prince could position his forces on elevated ground, while maintaining escape routes into the mountains. Caratacus arranged his warriors along a hillside protected by a stone rampart, with the river at their backs and steep slopes on either flank. The Roman assault began with artillery bombardment from ballistae and catapults, followed by a coordinated advance of legionary cohorts supported by auxiliary troops. The Welsh warriors, fighting for their homeland and inspired by Caratacus's presence, initially repelled several Roman attacks. However, Roman discipline and superior equipment gradually told. When auxiliary troops found a way around the Welsh flank, the tribal line began to crumble. Caratacus escaped the battlefield but was betrayed by Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes and handed over to the Romans. The capture of Caratacus did not end Welsh resistance. The Silures in particular continued their guerrilla campaign with undiminished fury. Roman sources record their attacks on Roman settlements and their ability to inflict heavy casualties on legionary patrols. The tribe's warriors developed sophisticated tactics for forest warfare, using their knowledge of local terrain to ambush Roman columns in narrow defiles where superior numbers and equipment provided little advantage. Scapula's death in 52 AD brought temporary respite to the Welsh tribes, but his successor, Aulus Didius Gallus, maintained pressure on the resistance. The new governor faced the challenge of pacifying tribes whose hatred of Rome had only intensified during years of warfare. Roman casualties mounted steadily as legionaries struggled to adapt to an enemy who refused to fight conventional battles, but instead waged a war of attrition that exploited every geographical advantage. The arrival of Sextus Julius Frontinus as governor in 74 AD marked a turning point in the Roman conquest of Wales. Frontinus brought fresh legions and a systematic approach to subduing the remaining independent tribes. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused on defeating individual leaders, Frontinus aimed to destroy the entire infrastructure of tribal resistance. His strategy involved simultaneous advances from multiple directions, preventing the Welsh from concentrating their forces or retreating to previously safe territories. Frontinus's most significant achievement was the conquest of the Silures, accomplished through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation. The governor established permanent forts in Silurian territory, garrisoned by troops who could respond quickly to any renewed resistance. These installations, connected by well-maintained roads, created a network of Roman control that made sustained guerrilla warfare increasingly difficult. The conquest of Anglesey represented the culmination of Roman efforts to break Welsh resistance. The island's significance extended far beyond its strategic location, serving as the spiritual heart of British Druidism and a repository of Celtic culture. Druids from across Britain sought refuge there, bringing with them treasures, sacred objects, and oral traditions that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. The island's fertile soil also provided grain that sustained resistance movements throughout Wales. Frontinus's assault on Anglesey in 78 AD involved careful preparation and coordination between land and naval forces. Roman engineers constructed a fleet of shallow draft vessels capable of navigating the Menai Strait's treacherous currents. The attack began at dawn with a coordinated landing at multiple points along the island's coast. Roman sources describe the terror of the defenders, Druids, warriors and civilians who had believed their island sanctuary impregnable. The slaughter that followed was systematic and deliberate. Roman soldiers, following orders to eliminate Druidism as a source of resistance, killed Druids wherever they found them and destroyed sacred groves that had served as centres of worship for generations. The burning of the Druids' libraries, if indeed they maintained written records alongside their oral traditions, represented an incalculable loss of Celtic knowledge and culture. Survivors were sold into slavery or executed, effectively ending Anglesey's role as a centre of anti-Roman resistance. The destruction of the Druidic centres had profound psychological effects on the remaining Welsh tribes. The Druids had provided not only spiritual guidance, but also political leadership and cultural continuity. Their elimination left a vacuum that Roman administrators were quick to fill with their own institutions and appointed officials. The conquest of Anglesey also demonstrated Roman determination to pursue their enemies to any refuge, no matter how remote or sacred. Following the military conquest, Roman administration in Wales focused on transforming tribal society according to imperial models. The process began with the establishment of civitates, administrative units based on existing tribal territories but governed according to Roman law. The Silures became the Civitas Silurum, the Ordovices became the Civitas Ordovicum, and the Demetae became the Civitas Demetarum. This system preserved tribal identity while subjecting it to Roman control. Roman urbanisation in Wales proceeded more slowly than in other parts of Britain, reflecting both the challenging terrain and the relatively sparse population. Caerleon, established as the permanent base of the Second Augusta Legion, became the most significant Roman settlement in Wales. The fortress covered 50 acres and housed approximately 5,000 legionaries along with auxiliary troops and civilian support staff. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated infrastructure including barracks, principia, granaries, workshops, and an impressive amphitheatre capable of seating 6,000 spectators. The civilian settlement that grew around Caerleon featured typical Roman amenities including baths, shops, taverns, and temples. The presence of the legion created demand for goods and services that attracted merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs from across the empire. Latin inscriptions found at the site reveal a cosmopolitan population, including soldiers from Germany, Spain, and North Africa, alongside native Britons who had adopted Roman customs and citizenship. Carmarthen, known to the Romans as Moridunum, served as the administrative centre for the Civitas Demitarum. The town's development reflected Roman efforts to create urban centres that could serve as focal points for Romanisation. Public buildings included a forum, basilica, and public baths constructed according to standard imperial designs. The surrounding countryside was divided into centuriation, a grid system of land division that facilitated taxation and agricultural management. The Roman road network in Wales represented one of the occupation's most enduring achievements. Engineers constructed routes that connected major settlements and military installations, while providing rapid movement for troops and supplies. Watling Street West linked Chester to Caerleon, while other roads connected coastal settlements and provided access to mineral resources in the Welsh interior. These roads required sophisticated engineering to navigate the challenging topography, including bridges, causeways, and mountain passes that remained in use for centuries after the Roman withdrawal. Military fortifications dotted the Welsh landscape, ranging from major legionary bases to smaller auxiliary forts and temporary camps. The Romans established a defensive line along the Welsh borders, anchored by major fortresses at Chester, Wroxeter, and Caerleon. Smaller forts controlled strategic passes and river crossings, while signal stations provided communication networks that allowed rapid response to any signs of unrest. The gradual Romanization of Welsh society involved complex negotiations between imperial administrators and tribal elites. Romans typically preferred to work through existing power structures rather than replacing them entirely, co-opting tribal leaders who demonstrated loyalty to the empire. These collaborating nobles received Roman citizenship, education for their children, and access to imperial patronage networks. In return, they helped collect taxes, recruit auxiliary soldiers, and maintain order in their territories. Archaeological evidence reveals the extent to which Roman material culture penetrated Welsh society during the occupation period. Excavations at villa sites show wealthy Britons adopting Roman architectural styles, decorative arts, and domestic arrangements. Pottery, metalwork, and jewellery found in Welsh settlements demonstrate the integration of local communities into empire-wide trading networks. Even in remote areas, Roman coins, manufactured goods, and architectural techniques became commonplace. The adoption of Roman religious practices occurred alongside the suppression of Druidism, though the process was neither uniform nor complete. Roman gods were often syncretized with Celtic deities, creating hybrid forms of worship that satisfied both imperial requirements and local traditions. Temples dedicated to Mars, for example, might incorporate attributes of Celtic war gods, while healing springs sacred to Celtic goddesses received Roman architectural treatment and dedications to Roman equivalents. Latin gradually became the language of administration, law, and commerce throughout Roman Wales, though Celtic languages certainly persisted in daily use among the general population. Inscriptions on tombstones and public monuments reveal the bilingual nature of Romano-British society, with Latin formulas combined with Celtic names and occasionally Celtic linguistic features. the educated elite became functionally bilingual, while ordinary farmers and craftsmen likely retained primarily Celtic speech, supplemented by Latin vocabulary related to government, military service and trade. The economic transformation of Wales under Roman rule involved both exploitation of natural resources and integration into imperial trading networks. Roman mining operations extracted gold from sites like Dal Alcuthi, lead and silver from the Mendips and other locations, and copper from Anglesey and Snowdonia. These extractive industries required substantial infrastructure including roads, aqueducts, and processing facilities that brought Roman technology and organisation to previously isolated areas. Agricultural changes accompanied urban development and resource extraction. Roman agricultural techniques, including new crops, improved ploughs, and systematic field drainage, increased productivity in suitable areas. Villa estates in the more fertile valleys of southern Wales adopted Mediterranean-style agriculture, producing surplus crops for urban markets and military consumption. The Roman preference for wheat over traditional Celtic crops like oats and barley gradually altered agricultural patterns throughout the occupied territories. The withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain in 410 AD created a power vacuum that fundamentally transformed the political landscape of Wales. Unlike the gradual decline experienced in other parts of the former empire, the end of Roman rule in Wales triggered an immediate fragmentation as local strongmen, tribal leaders, and Romano-British officials competed to fill the administrative void left by departing imperial authorities. The sophisticated Roman infrastructure of roads, fortifications, and urban centres remained largely intact, but the centralised system that had maintained them for nearly 4 centuries simply vanished overnight. The collapse of Roman monetary systems and trade networks forced Welsh communities to revert to localised economies based on barter and agricultural production. Towns like Caerleon and Carmarthen, which had depended on imperial administration and military garrisons for their prosperity, experienced dramatic population declines as merchants, craftsmen, and officials either fled or adapted to new circumstances. The great stone buildings that had symbolised Roman power stood empty, their hypocaust heating systems cold and their public baths abandoned to decay. From this chaos emerged a series of independent kingdoms that would define Welsh political organisation for the next millennium. These new polities did not spring fully formed from the ruins of Roman administration, but rather evolved through complex processes of territorial consolidation, dynastic marriage, military conquest, and diplomatic negotiation. The boundaries of these kingdoms reflected both geographical realities and the personal ambitions of their founders, creating a patchwork of competing authorities across the Welsh landscape. Gwynedd established itself as the most powerful of these successor states, controlling the mountainous northwest from its royal centre at Aberfraw on Anglesey. The kingdom's founders capitalised on the island's strategic position and agricultural wealth, which had made it valuable to both Celtic Druids and Roman administrators. Cunedda, the legendary founder of the Gwynedd dynasty, allegedly migrated from the Gododdin territory in what is now southern Scotland around 450 AD, bringing with him a warband of experienced fighters and the organisational skills necessary to impose order on the fragmented tribes of North Wales. The early kings of Gwynedd faced the immediate challenge of defending their territory against Irish raiders, who had established settlements along the western coast during the final decades of Roman rule. These Gaelic-speaking colonists, known as the Deisi, had taken advantage of weakened Roman defences to establish permanent footholds in Pembrokeshire and other coastal areas. The expulsion of these Irish settlers became a defining achievement of early Gwynedd rulers, who portrayed themselves as defenders of British Christianity against pagan invaders. Powys emerged as Gwynedd's primary rival, controlling the fertile valleys of the Upper Severn and the strategic border regions with Anglo-Saxon England. The kingdom's name derived from the Latin pagenses, meaning country dwellers, reflecting its origins among the rural populations who had remained outside the main centres of Roman urbanisation. Powys kings established their court at Mathrafal, positioned to control the vital trade routes connecting Wales with the English Midlands and the Irish Sea coast. The rulers of Powys adopted a more accommodating approach toward their Anglo-Saxon neighbours than their counterparts in Gwynedd, engaging in diplomatic marriages and commercial partnerships that often put them at odds with other Welsh kingdoms. This pragmatic policy reflected Powys's vulnerable geographical position, surrounded by potentially hostile neighbours and lacking the natural defensive barriers that protected Gwynedd and other western kingdoms. The kingdom's survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance between resistance and accommodation. Dyfed occupied the southwestern peninsula, its boundaries roughly corresponding to the former Roman civitas of the Demeter. The kingdom's rulers claimed descent from Eochaid al-Muir, an Irish prince who had allegedly received the territory as a grant from Magnus Maximus, the Romano-British usurper who briefly controlled much of the Western Roman Empire in the 380s. Whether or not this genealogical claim possessed historical validity, it reflected the complex cultural heritage of post-Roman Wales, where Celtic, Roman, and Irish influences merged to create distinctive regional identities. The kings of Dyfed maintained close connections with Ireland throughout the early medieval period, hosting Irish scholars and missionaries while participating in the extensive trade networks that connected the Irish sea communities. Archaeological evidence from royal sites like Lisbreachin reveals imported pottery, metalwork, and other luxury goods that demonstrate continued prosperity despite the collapse of Roman commercial systems. The kingdom's coastal location provided access to marine resources and facilitated communication with Christian communities in Ireland, Cornwall, and Brittany. Gwent controlled the southeastern regions, inheriting the former territory of the Silures along with the Roman infrastructure centred on Caerleon. The kingdom's rulers faced the unique challenge of governing a population that had experienced intensive Romanization, including substantial urban development and integration into imperial administrative systems. The presence of the abandoned legionary fortress at Caerleon provided both symbolic legitimacy and practical resources, as its massive stone walls and buildings could be adapted for royal use. The emergence of these kingdoms occurred alongside a remarkable religious transformation that would profoundly influence Welsh culture and identity. The collapse of Roman authority created opportunities for Christian missionaries to establish new forms of religious organisation independent of imperial control. Unlike the hierarchical episcopal structure that characterised Christianity in the surviving portions of the Roman Empire, Welsh Christianity developed along monastic lines that emphasised personal holiness, ascetic discipline, and community service. St. David emerged as the most significant figure in this religious revolution, establishing his monastery at Minervia around 550 AD. David's approach to Christian life emphasised extreme asceticism, with his monks following a regimen that included manual labour, vegetarian diet, and total abstinence from alcohol. Contemporary sources describe David himself as a tall, physically imposing man who wore rough clothing and maintained a stern demeanour that commanded respect from both followers and secular authorities. The monastery at Menevia became a centre of learning and missionary activity that attracted students from across the Celtic world. David's educational programme combined theological study with practical training in agriculture, crafts, and administration. Monks learned to read and write in both Latin and the vernacular, enabling them to serve as scribes, teachers, and advisors to local rulers. The monastery's scriptorium produced copies of religious texts, legal documents, and historical chronicles that preserved knowledge during the turbulent centuries following Roman withdrawal. David's influence extended far beyond his own monastery through the network of disciples who established daughter houses throughout Wales and beyond. These foundations followed the rule of David, which emphasised community self-sufficiency, charitable work, and missionary activity. Unlike the Benedictine monasticism that dominated continental Europe, Welsh monasticism maintained a distinctly Celtic character that incorporated pre-Christian traditions of sacred landscapes and seasonal festivals. St Illtyd established another major monastic centre at Llaniltud Fawr in Glamorgan, creating what contemporary sources described as the most important school in Britain. Illtyd himself possessed an unusual background for a monastic founder, having served as a warrior and courtier before experiencing a religious conversion that led him to embrace the ascetic life. His military experience proved valuable in organising monastic communities that could defend themselves against raiders while maintaining their spiritual mission. The curriculum at Llaniltud Fawr encompassed both religious and secular subjects, including rhetoric, mathematics, natural philosophy and law. Students came from aristocratic families throughout Britain and Ireland, creating networks of educated elites who shared common intellectual traditions despite their diverse political allegiances. Archaeological excavations at the site have revealed substantial stone buildings, workshops, and agricultural installations that supported a community of several hundred monks and students. Illtyd's most famous pupils included St David, St Sampson of Dol, and St Paul Aurelian, who carried Welsh monastic traditions to Brittany and established the Celtic Christianity that would flourish there for centuries. These missionary activities created cultural connections that transcended political boundaries, linking Welsh kingdoms with Celtic communities in Ireland, Scotland, Cornwall and Brittany through shared religious practices and intellectual traditions. St Tailo founded the monastery of Llandilo Fawr in Carmarthenshire, establishing another major centre of learning and religious authority. Tailo's approach emphasised pastoral care and social service, with his monks providing medical treatment, education, and legal assistance to surrounding communities. The saint's reputation for healing attracted pilgrims from across Wales, generating donations that supported extensive charitable activities. The monasteries established by these founding saints became focal points for the development of distinctly Welsh cultural traditions. Monastic scriptoriums preserved and transmitted the oral literature of pre-Christian Wales, adapting ancient stories and genealogies to Christian contexts while maintaining their essential character. The earliest Welsh poetry emerged from these monastic centres, combining traditional Celtic poetic techniques with Christian theological themes. The legal traditions that developed in post-Roman Wales reflected both the practical needs of the emerging kingdoms and the influence of Christian moral teaching. Local rulers required systematic approaches to dispute resolution, property rights, and criminal justice that could function without Roman imperial authority. The solutions they developed drew upon Celtic customary law, Roman legal principles that had survived in local practice, and Christian ethical teachings about justice and social responsibility. These early legal developments culminated in the codification undertaken by Hywel Dda during the 10th century. Hywel's legal code represented a systematic attempt to unify and standardise the diverse legal traditions that had evolved across the Welsh kingdoms during the preceding centuries. The king convened assemblies of judges, clerics and nobles who reviewed existing practices and created comprehensive legislation covering all aspects of social and economic life. The laws of Hywel Dda addressed property rights, marriage customs, inheritance patterns, and criminal penalties with remarkable sophistication and attention to practical detail. The code recognised the rights of women to own property and seek divorce under specified circumstances, provisions that were unusually progressive by medieval standards. The laws also established detailed procedures for resolving disputes through compensation rather than punishment, reflecting Celtic traditions that emphasise community harmony over retribution. Legal education became an important function of the monastic schools, which trained judges and legal advisors who could serve secular authorities while maintaining their religious vocations. These scholar monks created extensive commentaries on legal texts, preserving not only the letter of the law, but also the reasoning behind specific provisions. Their work ensured the transmission of legal knowledge across generations and provided flexibility for adapting ancient principles to changing circumstances. The cultural flowering that accompanied political and religious transformation found its most distinctive expression in the development of Welsh poetry and literature. The bardic tradition, which had its roots in pre-Roman Celtic society, experienced a renaissance in the monasteries and royal courts of the post-Roman kingdoms. Poets adapted traditional forms and themes to new circumstances, creating works that celebrated Christian virtues while maintaining the heroic ideals of warrior culture. The earliest surviving Welsh poetry includes praise poems composed for the rulers of various kingdoms, elegies commemorating fallen warriors, and religious verses that combine theological instruction with artistic expression. These works demonstrate sophisticated understanding of poetic technique, including complex patterns of alliteration, rhyme, and metre that required extensive training to master. The bardic schools that preserved these techniques operated under royal patronage, ensuring that poets maintained high social status and considerable influence in court circles. The Gododin, attributed to the poet Aneurin, represents one of the most significant achievements of early Welsh literature. This elegiac cycle commemorates the warriors who died fighting the Angles at the Battle of Catraeth around 600 AD, transforming a military disaster into a celebration of heroic sacrifice. The poem's complex structure and sophisticated language demonstrate the high level of artistic achievement possible within the Welsh poetic tradition. Religious poetry flourished alongside secular verse, with monastic poets creating hymns, prayers, and devotional works that combined theological sophistication with artistic beauty. These religious poems often incorporated imagery from the Welsh landscape, creating distinctly Celtic forms of Christian expression that differed markedly from continental European traditions. The integration of natural imagery with spiritual themes reflected the continuation of pre-Christian Celtic attitudes towards sacred landscapes and seasonal cycles. The preservation of genealogical traditions became another important function of Welsh literary culture. Poets and historians maintained detailed records of royal lineages that traced the descent of contemporary rulers back to legendary founders and ultimately to divine or semi-divine ancestors. These genealogies served both political and cultural functions, legitimizing dynastic claims while preserving historical memory of tribal origins and migrations. The development of prose literature proceeded more slowly than poetry, but produced works of comparable significance. The earliest Welsh prose includes legal texts, historical chronicles, and religious treatises that demonstrate the adaptation of Latin literary models to vernacular expression. These works reveal the influence of both classical Roman education and Celtic storytelling traditions, creating hybrid forms that were distinctively Welsh. The tranquil monasteries that had flourished along the Welsh coast during the Age of Saints faced an unprecedented threat as the 9th century dawned. Viking longships, their distinctive dragon prows cutting through the Irish Sea's grey waters, brought terror to communities that had known relative peace for generations. These Scandinavian raiders possessed intimate knowledge of coastal navigation, enabling them to strike without warning at isolated monasteries whose wealth in precious metals, manuscripts, and ecclesiastical treasures made them irresistible targets. The first recorded Viking attack on Wales occurred in 795 AD, when Norse raiders struck the monastery on Rathlin Island, just off the Irish coast, before turning their attention to the Welsh shores. The raiders understood that monasteries represented concentrated wealth accumulated through centuries of donations, pilgrimage offerings, and careful stewardship. Unlike fortified royal centres, these religious communities maintained minimal defences, relying on their sacred character and remote locations for protection that proved wholly inadequate against determined attackers. Bardsey Island, the sacred burial ground of 20,000 saints according to medieval tradition, suffered devastating raids that scattered its monastic community and destroyed irreplaceable manuscripts. The island's exposed position off the Lynn Peninsula made it easily accessible to Viking ships, while its reputation as a centre of learning and pilgrimage guaranteed substantial portable wealth. Archaeological evidence from the site reveals layers of ash and destruction dating to this period, along with scattered metalwork that suggests the raiders systematically looted the monastery's treasuries. The monastery of Llancarfan in the Vale of Glamorgan experienced repeated attacks that gradually eroded its capacity to function as a centre of learning and religious authority. Viking raiders targeted not only the monastery's material wealth, but also its human resources, capturing monks and students who could be sold in the thriving slave markets of Dublin and other Norse settlements. The loss of educated personnel proved as devastating as the destruction of buildings, as these communities depended on literate monks to maintain their educational and administrative functions. Coastal trading settlements suffered equally severe disruption as Viking raids made maritime commerce increasingly dangerous. The small ports that had developed around monastery complexes found their merchant vessels vulnerable to interception, while the communities that supported these trading activities faced constant threat of attack. The economic networks that had connected Welsh kingdoms with Ireland, Cornwall and Brittany began to contract as traders sought safer inland routes or abandoned certain markets entirely. The psychological impact of Viking raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage. Monastic chronicles describe the terror that gripped coastal communities as news of approaching longships spread through established warning networks. The sight of Viking sails on the horizon triggered mass evacuations as entire populations fled inland, abandoning their homes and possessions to seek refuge in fortified locations or remote mountain valleys. This constant state of alert disrupted agricultural cycles, interrupted craft production, and undermined the social stability that had characterised the early medieval Welsh kingdoms. Viking settlement patterns in Wales differed significantly from their approach in Ireland or northern England, where Scandinavian colonists established permanent bases and gradually integrated with local populations. Welsh geography and political organisation proved less conducive to large-scale Viking settlement, as the mountainous terrain offered limited agricultural potential, while the existing kingdom structure provided organised resistance to foreign occupation. Instead, Vikings used Wales primarily as a raiding ground and temporary refuge, establishing seasonal camps rather than permanent colonies. The island of Anglesey attracted particular Viking attention due to its fertile soil, strategic position, and historical significance as the centre of ancient Druidic culture. Norse raiders recognised the island's value as both a source of wealth and a potential base for controlling the Irish Sea shipping lanes. However, the kings of Gwynedd understood equally well that Anglesey's loss would fatally undermine their kingdom's economic foundation and symbolic authority, leading to fierce resistance against Viking attempts at permanent occupation. Rhodri Mawr emerged as the most successful Welsh ruler in responding to the Viking threat, transforming the challenge of external invasion into an opportunity for internal consolidation. Born around 820 AD, Rhodri inherited the kingdom of Gwynedd through his father Merfyn Frith, who had established the dynasty's legitimacy through marriage alliances and military success. The young king quickly demonstrated exceptional abilities in both warfare and diplomacy that would earn him recognition as the first ruler to unite most of Wales under single authority. Rhodri's strategic vision encompassed far more than simple defence against Viking raiders. He recognised that the fragmented nature of Welsh political organisation provided opportunities for external enemies while limiting the resources available for effective resistance. The traditional system of independent kingdoms, each jealously guarding its autonomy, had functioned adequately during periods of relative peace but proved inadequate when confronted with coordinated external threats requiring unified response. The king's first major expansion occurred through his marriage to Angharad, sister of Cyngenap Cadell, the last king of Powys. This diplomatic alliance positioned Rhodri to inherit Powys when Singen died without male heirs in 855 AD, suddenly doubling the territory under his direct control. The acquisition of Powys brought Rhodri not only additional military resources, but also control over the crucial border regions with Anglo-Saxon England, enabling him to coordinate Welsh resistance across multiple frontiers. Rhodri's expansion into Deheubarth followed a similar pattern of strategic marriage and inheritance. His marriage to Angharad also connected him to the ruling dynasty of Saesilg, a kingdom that controlled much of central Wales. When the male line of Saesilg ended, Rhodri's descendants inherited these territories, creating a unified Welsh state that stretched from Anglesey to the southern coast. This consolidation process required careful negotiation with local nobles who retained significant autonomy within the expanded kingdom structure. The administrative challenges of governing such an extensive territory demanded innovations in royal government that went far beyond traditional Celtic kingship models. Rhodri established a network of royal officials who could represent his authority in distant regions, while maintaining communication with the central court through regular assemblies and written correspondence. These administrators, drawn from both the traditional nobility and educated clerics, created the bureaucratic foundation necessary for effective unified government. Military organisation underwent equally significant transformation under Rhodri's direction. The traditional Celtic system of seasonal warfare conducted by noble warriors supported by their personal retainers proved inadequate for defending extensive territories against mobile Viking raiders. Rhodri developed more systematic approaches to military recruitment that could maintain standing forces capable of rapid deployment to threatened areas while preserving agricultural productivity necessary for supporting these expanded military commitments. The king's most celebrated military achievement occurred in 856 AD when his forces defeated and killed Gorm, a prominent Viking leader whose raids had terrorised the Welsh coast for several years. This victory demonstrated that unified Welsh resistance could successfully challenge Viking military superiority, encouraging other rulers to coordinate their defensive efforts rather than relying on individual kingdom resources. The battle's psychological impact proved as significant as its immediate military consequences, restoring Welsh confidence while discouraging further Viking aggression. Rhodri's success against Viking raiders attracted attention from Anglo-Saxon England, where King Ethelwulf of Wessex faced similar threats to his own territories. The two rulers established diplomatic contacts that led to marriage alliances and mutual assistance agreements, creating the first formal cooperation between Welsh and English kingdoms since the Roman withdrawal. These diplomatic initiatives reflected Rhodri's sophisticated understanding of the broader political situation in Britain, where traditional ethnic antagonisms required modification in the face of external threats. The expansion of Rhodri's authority inevitably created tensions with neighbouring kingdoms that had previously enjoyed independence. The rulers of Gwent and other southeastern Welsh kingdoms viewed Gwyned's growing power with suspicion, fearing that their own autonomy would eventually fall victim to Rhodri's unification programme. These concerns led to intermittent conflicts that weakened overall Welsh resistance while providing opportunities for both Viking and Anglo-Saxon intervention in Welsh affairs. Rhodri's death in 878 AD, reportedly while fighting Anglo-Saxon invaders, marked the end of the first successful attempt at Welsh unification, but not the end of the political transformation he had initiated. His sons divided the expanded kingdom according to traditional inheritance practices, with Anarald receiving Gwynedd, Cadell taking Saesilg, and Myrddin inheriting Powys. This partition restored the traditional pattern of multiple kingdoms, but within a framework of family cooperation that maintained many advantages of unified government. The dynasty established by Rhodri Mawr continued to dominate Welsh politics for the next 2 centuries, with his descendants competing for supremacy, while maintaining the principle that legitimate authority derived from membership in his royal lineage. This genealogical legitimacy provided stability during periods of political fragmentation, while creating the ideological foundation for future unification attempts. The concept of Welsh unity, which had been largely theoretical before Rhodri's reign, became a practical political objective that subsequent rulers could pursue with reasonable prospects of success. Internal warfare between the Welsh kingdoms intensified during the 10th and early 11th centuries as Rhodri's descendants competed for supremacy, while external pressures from both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons continued to threaten Welsh independence. The fragmentation of Rhodri's unified kingdom had restored traditional rivalries between Gwynedd, Powys and Deheubarth. But these conflicts now occurred within a context of shared dynastic heritage that made reconciliation possible even after bitter warfare. Gwynedd maintained its position as the most powerful Welsh kingdom under Rhodri's descendants, controlling the fertile island of Anglesey and the strategic mountain passes that connected North Wales with the rest of Britain. The kingdom's rulers exploited their geographical advantages to maintain independence from both Viking and Anglo-Saxon pressure, while intervening in the affairs of neighbouring Welsh territories. Gwynedd's military strength derived not only from its defensive position, but also from its ability to recruit warriors from the hardy mountain populations who possessed intimate knowledge of the challenging terrain. Powys faced the most difficult strategic situation among the major Welsh kingdoms, surrounded by potentially hostile neighbours and lacking the natural defensive barriers that protected Gwynedd and Deheubarth. The kingdom's rulers adopted pragmatic policies that emphasised diplomatic flexibility over military confrontation, seeking alliances with whichever external power offered the best prospects for maintaining autonomy. This approach often put Powys at odds with other Welsh kingdoms that favoured more aggressive resistance to foreign influence. Deheubarth emerged as a significant power during the 10th century under the leadership of Hywel Dda, who successfully united the southern Welsh kingdoms and established legal and administrative systems that would influence Welsh governance for centuries. Hywel's approach to kingship emphasised internal development over external conquest, focusing on legal codification, economic development, and cultural patronage that strengthened his kingdom's institutional foundations, while avoiding the military conflicts that weakened his rivals. The competition between these major kingdoms created opportunities for smaller territories to assert their independence or align themselves with whichever major power offered the most favourable terms. Gwent, Brycheiniog, and other southeastern kingdoms frequently changed their allegiances as political circumstances shifted, creating a complex web of alliances that reflected both immediate military necessities and long-term strategic calculations. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn emerged from this competitive environment as the most successful Welsh ruler since Rhodri Mawr, achieving the remarkable feat of uniting all Welsh territories under his personal authority. Born around 1007 AD, Gruffydd inherited the kingdom of Gwynedd during a period of particular instability when Viking raids had resumed, and Anglo-Saxon pressure was intensifying under the aggressive expansionist policies of English kings like Edward the Confessor. Gruffydd's rise to supreme power began with his conquest of Powys in 1039 AD, achieved through a combination of military victory and diplomatic manipulation that eliminated his principal rivals in central Wales. The king's forces demonstrated superior organisation and equipment compared to traditional Welsh armies, suggesting that he had learned from both Viking and Anglo-Saxon military innovations, while adapting them to Welsh conditions and requirements. The conquest of Deheubarth proved more challenging, requiring sustained military campaigns that lasted several years and involved complex negotiations with local nobles who retained significant influence in their territories. Gruffydd's success in southern Wales reflected not only his military capabilities, but also his political skill in convincing established elites that their interests would be better served under unified Welsh rule than through continued fragmentation and external interference. By 1055 AD, Gruffydd had achieved what no previous Welsh ruler had accomplished, establishing direct authority over all the traditional Welsh kingdoms while maintaining the loyalty of local nobles and the support of the general population. His unified Welsh state represented a formidable military and political force that could challenge both Viking raiders an Anglo-Saxon expansion on equal terms, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Britain. Gruffydd's conflicts with Anglo-Saxon England reflected both his territorial ambitions and his determination to secure Welsh independence against English expansionist pressure. The king's forces conducted successful raids into English territory, capturing significant amounts of plunder while demonstrating Welsh military capability to English audiences who had previously regarded Welsh kingdoms as minor irritants rather than serious threats. These aggressive policies inevitably led to major confrontations with English armies that possessed superior resources and more sophisticated military organisation. The Battle of Reedy Groes in 1039 AD marked Gruffydd's first major victory against English forces, establishing his reputation as a formidable military commander while providing the resources necessary for further expansion. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of Welsh tactics when properly coordinated and supplied, as Gruffydd's forces successfully exploited their superior knowledge of local terrain to defeat a larger English army that had expected easy victory against fragmented Welsh resistance. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn's death in 1063 AD at the hands of his own men marked the end of Welsh unity and created the political vacuum that would facilitate Norman penetration into Wales. The assassination, orchestrated by nobles who had grown weary of constant warfare against Anglo-Saxon England, fragmented the unified Welsh state that Gruffydd had spent decades constructing. His death came at the worst possible moment for Welsh independence, occurring just 3 years before William of Normandy's conquest of England would fundamentally alter the political landscape of Britain and introduce a new, more systematic form of expansionism that would prove far more dangerous than previous Anglo-Saxon pressure. The immediate aftermath of Gruffydd's assassination saw the rapid dissolution of his unified kingdom as regional nobles reasserted their traditional autonomy. Bleddyn ap Cynfyn and Rhywallan ap Cynfyn, half-brothers of the dead king, divided Gwynedd and Powys between them, while attempting to maintain some semblance of coordinated resistance against external threats. However, their authority remained tenuous, dependent on the continued loyalty of local nobles, who had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate rulers whose policies they found objectionable. In Deheubarth, the situation proved even more chaotic as multiple claimants emerged to contest the succession. Maredudd ab Owain ap Edwin established himself in Ceredigion, while Rhys ab Owain claimed authority in Dyfed, creating competing centres of power that weakened southern Welsh resistance precisely when unity was most desperately needed. These succession disputes consumed resources and attention that should have been directed toward preparing for the inevitable Norman advance into Welsh territory. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066 AD initially appeared to offer opportunities for Welsh recovery, as the Norman Duke faced years of consolidating his control over England and suppressing Anglo-Saxon resistance. The Welsh kingdoms, freed from immediate English pressure, might have used this respite to rebuild their military strength and restore political unity. Instead, the period following the Norman conquest witnessed continued internal warfare as Welsh rulers pursued traditional dynastic conflicts, while remaining largely oblivious to the revolutionary changes occurring across Offa's Dyke. The Norman approach to expansion differed fundamentally from previous Anglo-Saxon methods, combining systematic military organisation with sophisticated administrative techniques that had been developed during the conquest of England. Unlike Anglo-Saxon kings who had typically sought tribute and submission from Welsh rulers, while allowing them to retain internal autonomy, the Normans aimed at direct territorial control through the establishment of feudal lordships that would integrate conquered Welsh territories into their broader imperial system. William's initial strategy for dealing with Wales involved the appointment of powerful Norman barons to control the English border regions, granting them extensive authority to expand their territories westward at Welsh expense. These Marcher lords, as they became known, received virtually unlimited license to conquer Welsh lands through their own resources and initiative, with the understanding that successful expansion would be rewarded with permanent tenure over their acquisitions. This system effectively privatised the conquest of Wales, allowing the Norman king to achieve territorial expansion without committing royal resources to prolonged military campaigns. Hugh d'Avranches, appointed Earl of Chester in 1071 AD, established the first major Norman presence along the Welsh border. Hugh, known as Hugh the Fat due to his enormous physical bulk, possessed both the military resources and personal ambition necessary to launch sustained attacks against the Welsh kingdoms. His earldom encompassed not only the strategic city of Chester, but also extensive territories in Cheshire and Shropshire that provided the economic foundation for military expansion westward into Gwynedd and Powys. Hugh's approach to Welsh conquest combined traditional Norman military tactics with innovative logistical arrangements that enabled sustained operations in the challenging Welsh terrain. His forces included heavily armoured cavalry that could dominate open battlefield encounters, supported by infantry formations equipped with crossbows and siege equipment capable of reducing Welsh fortifications. More importantly, Hugh established supply depots and fortified bases that allowed his armies to maintain pressure on Welsh territories even during extended campaigns. The Earl of Chester's first major success occurred with the capture of the cantref of Tegyingal in northeastern Wales, achieved through a systematic campaign that combined military pressure with diplomatic manipulation of local Welsh nobles. Hugh's forces constructed a series of motte and bailey castles that controlled key river crossings and mountain passes, creating a network of fortified positions that made Welsh counterattacks increasingly difficult while providing secure bases for further expansion. Roger de Montgomery, appointed Earl of Shrewsbury, pursued similar expansionist policies from his base in the central Welsh borderlands. Roger's strategic position allowed him to threaten both Powys and the northern regions of Deheubarth, forcing Welsh rulers to divide their defensive resources between multiple threatened frontiers. His construction of Montgomery Castle in 1071 AD established Norman presence deep in traditional Welsh territory, serving both as a military stronghold and a symbol of Norman determination to achieve permanent conquest rather than temporary submission. The Montgomery family's expansion into Wales demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman castle-building techniques in establishing control over conquered territories. Unlike the hill forts and royal courts that had served as centres of Welsh authority, Norman castles were specifically designed to dominate surrounding countryside through their strategic positioning and formidable defensive capabilities. These stone fortifications, constructed by skilled engineers using techniques developed during the conquest of England, proved virtually impregnable to Welsh assault while providing secure bases for Norman military operations. William Fitzosbern, Earl of Hereford, established the third major Norman presence along the Welsh border, controlling the southeastern approaches that had traditionally provided access to the fertile valleys of Gwent and Glamorgan. Fitzosbern's aggressive expansion into Welsh territory proceeded with remarkable speed, as his forces captured Chepstow in 1067 AD and established a powerful castle that controlled the lower Wye Valley. This strategic position enabled Norman forces to threaten the heart of southeastern Wales while cutting communications between the Welsh kingdoms and their potential allies in Cornwall and Brittany. The establishment of these three major marcher lordships created a coordinated threat to Welsh independence that surpassed anything the kingdoms had previously faced. The Norman earls possessed superior military technology, more sophisticated organisational capabilities, and virtually unlimited resources compared to their Welsh opponents. More significantly, their systematic approach to territorial conquest aimed at permanent occupation rather than the temporary submission that had satisfied previous Anglo-Saxon rulers. Welsh resistance to Norman expansion initially followed traditional patterns of guerrilla warfare that had proven effective against earlier invaders. Welsh forces avoided direct confrontation with heavily armoured Norman cavalry, instead launching surprise attacks against supply columns, isolated garrisons, and construction crews working on new fortifications. These tactics achieved considerable tactical success, inflicting heavy casualties on Norman forces while avoiding the decisive battles that would have favoured the invaders' superior equipment and organisation. Rhys ap Gruffydd emerged as the most effective leader of Welsh resistance during the initial phase of Norman expansion. Born around 1132 AD, Rhys inherited the throne of Deheubarth during a period of extreme crisis when Norman forces had already captured much of southeastern Wales and were advancing steadily into the traditional heartlands of Welsh independence. The young king faced the challenge of uniting the fragmented Welsh kingdoms while simultaneously conducting active resistance against Norman expansion. Rhys's strategic approach emphasised the coordination of Welsh resistance across multiple kingdoms, recognising that isolated resistance by individual rulers would inevitably fail against Norman military superiority. He established communication networks that enabled rapid coordination of military operations while creating diplomatic arrangements that allowed Welsh forces to concentrate against specific Norman targets rather than dissipating their strength in uncoordinated local resistance. The Prince of Deheubarth's military innovations adapted traditional Welsh tactics to exploit Norman weaknesses while minimising the impact of their advantages. Rhys understood that Norman cavalry dominated open battlefields, but became vulnerable when operating in the forested valleys and steep hillsides that characterised much of Welsh terrain. His forces developed sophisticated ambush techniques that could neutralise heavily armoured knights while avoiding the prolonged engagements that would favour Norman numerical superiority. Rhys's most significant military achievement occurred during the siege of Cardigan Castle in 1165 AD, where his forces successfully captured one of the most important Norman strongholds in central Wales. The siege demonstrated Welsh ability to adapt their traditional military methods to assault fortified positions, using innovative siege techniques that combine traditional Celtic warfare with lessons learned from observing Norman military engineering. The capture of Cardigan provided Rhys with a strategic base for further operations, while demonstrating that Norman castles were not invulnerable to determined Welsh assault. The success at Cardigan encouraged other Welsh rulers to coordinate their resistance efforts under Rhys's leadership, creating the most effective anti-Norman coalition since the death of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn. Owain Gwynedd contributed forces from northern Wales, while the rulers of Powys provided support from the central borderlands, enabling Rhys to conduct sustained military operations that gradually reduced Norman territorial gains throughout central and southern Wales. Welsh adaptation to Norman military technology proceeded gradually as resistance leaders recognised the necessity of matching their enemies' capabilities in siege warfare and fortification construction. Welsh craftsmen learned to construct crossbows and other siege equipment by studying captured Norman weapons, while Welsh engineers developed techniques for building stone fortifications that could withstand Norman assault. These technological adaptations required substantial resources and expertise that strained the limited capabilities of the Welsh kingdoms, but proved essential for effective resistance. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed by Welsh resistance forces exploited their superior knowledge of local terrain while avoiding the pitched battles that would have favoured Norman military advantages. Welsh warriors conducted night raids against Norman camps, ambushed supply convoys in narrow mountain passes, and launched coordinated attacks against isolated castles during construction phases when their defences remained incomplete. These operations inflicted steady casualties on Norman forces while avoiding the decisive confrontations that could have ended Welsh resistance through single catastrophic defeats. Norman responses to Welsh guerrilla tactics involved the systematic construction of fortified positions that could control key strategic points while providing secure bases for military operations. The Marcher Lords established networks of motte and bailey castles that dominated river crossings, mountain passes, and fertile valleys, creating barriers to Welsh movement while facilitating Norman expansion into previously inaccessible territories. These fortifications required constant maintenance and substantial garrisons, straining Norman resources while providing targets for Welsh assault. The development of marcher lordships represented a fundamental transformation in the political organisation of the Welsh borderlands, creating autonomous territories that operated according to feudal principles rather than traditional Celtic customs. The marcher lords exercised virtually unlimited authority within their territories, maintaining private armies, constructing fortifications, and administering justice according to Norman legal traditions. This system effectively created independent principalities along the Welsh border that possessed the resources and autonomy necessary for sustained territorial expansion. Roger de Montgomery's expansion into central Wales demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic Norman colonisation techniques. His forces constructed a series of fortified towns that served both military and economic functions, attracting Norman and Flemish settlers who could provide agricultural and commercial development while supporting military operations. These planted towns, protected by substantial fortifications and garrisoned by professional soldiers, created permanent Norman presence in conquered Welsh territories while generating the economic resources necessary for further expansion. The Lordship of Glamorgan, established by Robert FitzHarmon following his conquest of the region in the 1090s, illustrated the comprehensive nature of Norman territorial control. FitzHarmon's administration replaced traditional Welsh legal and social systems with Norman feudal arrangements, granting land to Norman knights who owed military service in exchange for their holdings. This systematic colonisation created a Norman ruling class that possessed both the motivation and capability to maintain control over the conquered Welsh population while supporting further expansion. Norman castle construction in Wales employed architectural techniques that had been refined during the conquest of England and earlier Norman expansion in France and southern Italy. The earliest Norman fortifications in Wales consisted primarily of motte and bailey constructions that could be erected quickly using local materials and labour. These wooden fortifications provided immediate defensive capabilities while serving as bases for more substantial stone constructions that would follow once Norman control had been consolidated. The transition from wooden to stone castle construction marked the permanent establishment of Norman authority in conquered Welsh territories. Castles like Chepstow, begun by William Fitz-Osbern in 1067 AD, demonstrated the sophistication of Norman military engineering and the resources available for sustained construction projects. These stone fortifications required years to complete and substantial financial investment, but they provided virtually impregnable defensive positions that could control extensive territories with relatively small garrisons. The economic impact of Norman expansion on Welsh society proved as significant as the immediate military consequences. Norman conquest disrupted traditional Welsh agricultural patterns, trade relationships, and craft production, while introducing new economic systems based on feudal obligations and monetary exchange. Welsh communities that had operated according to kinship-based social organisation found themselves subject to Norman legal systems that emphasised individual property rights and contractual obligations. Norman colonisation brought substantial numbers of foreign settlers into Welsh territories, fundamentally altering the demographic composition of conquered regions. These settlers included not only Norman knights and their retainers, but also Flemish farmers, English craftsmen, and merchants from various parts of the Norman Empire. The newcomers established towns and villages according to continental European models, while introducing agricultural techniques and commercial practices that gradually transformed the Welsh economy. The House of Gwynedd emerged as the most successful Welsh dynasty in adapting to the challenges posed by Norman expansion, while maintaining effective resistance to complete conquest. Owain Gwynedd, who ruled from 1137 to 1170 AD, demonstrated exceptional skill in balancing military resistance with diplomatic negotiation, achieving recognition of his authority from English kings while preserving Welsh independence in his core territories. Owain's strategic approach, emphasised the construction of stone castles that could match Norman fortifications while maintaining the mobility necessary for effective guerrilla warfare. His forces learned to conduct siege operations against Norman strongholds while defending their own territories through a combination of fixed fortifications and mobile resistance. This dual approach enabled Gwynedd to maintain effective resistance while gradually expanding its authority over neighbouring Welsh territories. The diplomatic achievements of Yvain Gwynedd established precedents for Welsh-English relations that would influence subsequent negotiations for centuries. His ability to secure recognition of his royal title from Henry II of England demonstrated that Welsh resistance could achieve political objectives through negotiation when supported by effective military pressure. These diplomatic successes encouraged other Welsh rulers to coordinate their policies with Gwynedd, while maintaining hope that complete Norman conquest could be avoided through skillful political manoeuvring. Llywelyn the Great inherited the throne of Gwynedd in 1195 AD during a period when Norman expansion had stalled. But Welsh unity remained fragmented among competing dynasties and territorial claims. The young prince recognised that effective resistance to Norman pressure required not only military capability, but also the political unity that had been lacking since the death of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn more than a century earlier. His reign would witness the most successful attempt at Welsh reunification since the 11th century, establishing the foundation for the final flowering of independent Welsh political authority. Llywelyn ap Gruffyd's severed head arrived at Edward Longshanks's court wrapped in linen, its lifeless eyes staring from features that had once commanded the loyalty of every Welsh prince from Anglesey to the Wye Valley. The English king ordered the head displayed on the Tower of London, crowned mockingly with ivy, in a grotesque parody of the ancient Celtic tradition that honoured fallen heroes. This macabre trophy, exhibited for the jeering crowds of London throughout the winter of 1282, symbolised more than the death of a single ruler. It marked the extinction of independent Welsh kingship that had endured for 8 centuries since the Roman withdrawal. The circumstances surrounding Llywelyn's death reflected the systematic nature of Edward's conquest strategy, which combined overwhelming military force with sophisticated intelligence networks that penetrated the highest levels of Welsh society. The Prince of Wales had been lured into a trap near Builth Wells by promises of support from local nobles who had secretly negotiated their surrender to English forces. His small escort, expecting to meet allies, instead encountered English soldiers who recognised the distinctive figure of the last independent Welsh ruler, despite his attempt to travel incognito through the borderlands of his shrinking principality. The battle that claimed Llywelyn's life lasted mere minutes, as the prince's handful of companions faced impossible odds against prepared English forces. Contemporary accounts describe how Llywelyn fought with desperate courage, his sword cutting down several attackers before an English spear found the gap between his mail hauberk and helmet. The prince's death occurred not in the grand pitched battle he might have preferred, but in a muddy skirmish on a December afternoon, his body initially unrecognised among the Welsh casualties, until an English soldier noticed the distinctive golden circlet that marked his royal status. Edward's conquest of Wales had begun 2 decades earlier, not with dramatic military campaigns, but through the patient accumulation of legal pretexts and territorial advantages that gradually constricted Welsh independence. The English king possessed an intimate understanding of feudal law that enabled him to challenge Welsh territorial claims through English courts, while simultaneously building the military infrastructure necessary for eventual conquest. His approach combined the methodical preparation of a skilled lawyer with the ruthless determination of a warrior king who had already demonstrated his capabilities in crushing baronial opposition within England. The legal foundation for Edward's Welsh campaigns rested on his interpretation of the homage that previous Welsh rulers had rendered to English kings, which he claimed established permanent feudal obligations that superseded Welsh claims to independent sovereignty. This argument, while historically questionable, provided the diplomatic justification necessary for presenting conquest as the enforcement of legitimate feudal rights rather than naked territorial aggression. Edward's lawyers constructed elaborate genealogical arguments that traced English royal authority over Wales back to legendary British kings, creating legal precedents that satisfied contemporary European standards for justified warfare. The systematic nature of Edward's military preparation became evident through his construction of supply depots, road improvements, and logistical arrangements that enabled sustained military operations in the challenging Welsh terrain. English engineers surveyed potential campaign routes years before actual hostilities began, identifying river crossings, suitable campsites, and strategic positions for temporary fortifications. This advanced planning eliminated many of the logistical problems that had plagued previous English campaigns in Wales, where difficult terrain and extended supply lines had often forced premature withdrawals despite tactical victories. Edward's first major campaign in 1277 demonstrated the effectiveness of his systematic approach to Welsh conquest. Rather than attempting the rapid strikes that had characterised earlier English interventions, the king deployed 3 coordinated armies that advanced simultaneously from Chester, Montgomery and Carmarthen, creating converging pressure that prevented Welsh forces from concentrating against any single threat. Each English army included substantial numbers of Welsh allies recruited from regions that had submitted to English authority, providing local knowledge and reducing the appearance of foreign conquest. The siege of Dolphin Castle during this campaign illustrated Edward's determination to eliminate every symbol of Welsh independence, regardless of the military necessity involved. The castle, recently constructed by Llywelyn ap Gruffudd as a symbol of Welsh sovereignty, possessed limited strategic value but enormous symbolic importance as a demonstration of independent Welsh authority. Edward's forces invested months in reducing this relatively minor fortification, employing sophisticated siege engines and mining techniques that demonstrated English commitment to total victory rather than negotiated settlement. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's submission following the 1277 campaign reflected his realistic assessment of Welsh military capabilities against Edward's systematically planned conquest. The Prince of Wales retained his title and authority over Gwynedd west of the River Conwy, but his acceptance of feudal subordination to the English crown fundamentally altered the nature of Welsh political authority. The ceremony of homage performed at Rhuddlan Castle required Llywelyn to kneel before Edward and acknowledge his status as a feudal vassal, a humiliation that undermined his authority among Welsh nobles who had previously regarded him as an independent sovereign. The Treaty of Aberconwy established the legal framework for Edward's gradual absorption of Welsh territories through a combination of direct annexation and feudal subordination. The agreement transferred substantial Welsh territories to direct English control, while subjecting the remaining Welsh lands to English legal oversight and military supervision. Edward's negotiators crafted the treaty's provisions to ensure that future Welsh resistance would constitute rebellion against legitimate feudal authority rather than warfare between independent nations, eliminating the diplomatic protections that had previously limited English military actions. Welsh resistance to this imposed settlement emerged gradually as the full implications of English control became apparent to local populations. The introduction of English legal procedures, taxation systems, and administrative officials created daily reminders of lost independence that generated resentment among all levels of Welsh society. English sheriffs replaced Welsh judges in administering local justice, while English tax collectors demanded payments according to assessments that ignored traditional Welsh customs regarding communal property and seasonal obligations. The rebellion that erupted in 1282 began not with coordinated political planning but through spontaneous local resistance to specific English administrative measures. Welsh communities in different regions independently rejected English authority, creating a general uprising that surprised both English officials and Welsh leaders with its scope and intensity. The simultaneous nature of these local rebellions suggested that Welsh resentment of English rule had reached levels that required only minimal coordination to produce widespread resistance. Dafydd ap Gruffudd's decision to join the rebellion transformed scattered local uprisings into a coordinated national resistance movement. Llywelyn's younger brother had previously collaborated with English authorities, accepting lands and privileges in exchange for supporting Edward's conquest of Wales. His dramatic reversal, marked by his attack on Hawarden Castle in March 1282, provided the rebellion with experienced military leadership while demonstrating that even collaborating Welsh nobles had concluded that accommodation with English rule was impossible. The siege of Hawarden Castle revealed the sophisticated military capabilities that Welsh forces had developed during years of resistance to English expansion. Dafydd's assault employed coordinated infantry attacks supported by siege engines, constructed according to contemporary European standards, indicating that Welsh military technology had evolved far beyond the traditional methods that had characterised earlier resistance movements. The successful capture of this strongly fortified position demonstrated Welsh ability to conduct complex military operations that matched English tactical sophistication. Edward's response to the Welsh rebellion demonstrated the military resources and organisational capabilities that made him the most formidable opponent Welsh independence had ever faced. The English king mobilised forces that dwarfed previous English armies deployed in Wales, including substantial numbers of professional soldiers recruited from across the Plantagenet domains. These troops possessed superior equipment, training and experience compared to Welsh forces, while operating according to tactical doctrines that had proven successful in Edward's earlier campaigns in Scotland and Gascony. The English army that advanced into Wales in 1282 included innovations in military organisation that reflected Edward's systematic approach to warfare. Professional engineers accompanied the main forces, equipped with prefabricated siege engines and specialised tools for constructing field fortifications. Supply trains carried provisions calculated to sustain extended operations without dependence on local resources, while mounted messengers maintained communication between separated columns operating across the challenging Welsh terrain. Edward's strategy for the final conquest of Wales emphasised the systematic reduction of Welsh strongholds rather than the pursuit of decisive battles that might allow Welsh forces to inflict significant casualties on English armies. This methodical approach required substantial time and resources, but minimised English losses while ensuring that each captured position could be permanently fortified and garrisoned. The king understood that Welsh resistance depended on the availability of secure bases from which guerrilla operations could be launched, making the elimination of these refugees essential for permanent conquest. The siege of Castell-y-Bear demonstrated Edward's determination to eliminate every vestige of Welsh military capability, regardless of the strategic importance of individual positions. This remote fortress in the mountains of Meirionnydd possessed minimal military value but served as a symbol of continued Welsh resistance. Edward's forces invested considerable effort in reducing the castle, employing siege techniques that included the construction of elaborate earthworks and the deployment of heavy catapults transported across difficult mountain terrain. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's death near Builth Wells eliminated the last credible claimant to independent Welsh sovereignty, but Edward recognised that military conquest alone could not guarantee permanent English control over Wales. The English king's subsequent policies aimed at the systematic destruction of Welsh political, legal and cultural institutions that might serve as foundations for future resistance movements. This comprehensive approach to conquest reflected Edward's understanding that successful imperial expansion required the elimination of indigenous systems that could provide alternative sources of authority and identity. The capture and execution of Dafydd ap Gruffudd in 1283 completed Edward's destruction of the House of Gwynedd, while providing an opportunity to demonstrate English justice to Welsh audiences. Dafydd's trial at Shrewsbury followed English legal procedures that emphasised his status as a rebel against legitimate feudal authority, rather than a captured enemy leader entitled to honourable treatment. The elaborate nature of his execution, which included drawing, hanging and quartering, was specifically designed to terrorise potential Welsh resistance while symbolically destroying the last representative of independent Welsh kingship. The Statute of Rhuddlan, promulgated in 1284, established the legal and administrative framework for Edward's permanent control over conquered Welsh territories. This comprehensive legislation replaced Welsh legal traditions with English common law, while creating administrative structures that integrated Welsh territories into the broader English governmental system. The statute's provisions demonstrated Edward's intention to eliminate Welsh political autonomy entirely, rather than merely establishing English suzerainty over subordinate Welsh rulers. The administrative reorganisation mandated by the Statute of Rhuddlan divided conquered Welsh territories into shires, administered according to English models, with sheriffs appointed by the English Crown exercising authority previously held by Welsh princes and their officials. These new administrative units deliberately ignored traditional Welsh territorial boundaries, creating artificial divisions that weakened local loyalties while facilitating English control. The shire system enabled Edward to appoint English administrators who possessed no local connections that might compromise their loyalty to English interests. English legal procedures introduced through the Statute of Rhuddlan fundamentally altered Welsh social relationships by replacing customary law based on kinship obligations with common law, emphasising individual property rights and contractual relationships. Welsh communities that had operated according to traditional patterns of collective landholding and mutual obligation found themselves subject to legal systems that recognised only individual ownership and monetary exchange. These changes undermined traditional Welsh social structures, while creating opportunities for English colonists to acquire Welsh lands through legal procedures that Welsh farmers could not understand or afford to contest. The construction of Edward's Iron Ring of castles began immediately following the completion of military conquest, demonstrating the king's determination to create permanent physical symbols of English authority throughout Wales. These fortifications differed fundamentally from the temporary military installations that had supported the conquest campaigns, incorporating architectural innovations and defensive capabilities that reflected the most advanced military engineering of the late 13th century. The scale and sophistication of these construction projects indicated Edward's intention to maintain English control over Wales indefinitely, rather than merely suppressing immediate resistance. Caernarfon Castle represented the most ambitious of Edward's Welsh fortifications, designed to serve as both a military stronghold and a symbolic demonstration of English imperial authority. The castle's distinctive polygonal towers and banded masonry deliberately echoed the walls of Constantinople, creating visual associations with imperial Rome that emphasised Edward's claims to legitimate sovereignty over ancient British territories. Construction began in 1283 using master craftsmen recruited from across Europe, while local Welsh labour provided the manual work necessary for moving massive quantities of stone and timber. The strategic positioning of Caernarfon Castle controlled the entrance to the Menai Strait, while dominating the ancient Welsh royal centre of Aberfraw, symbolically replacing Welsh political authority with English military power. The castle's design incorporated residential quarters suitable for royal occupation, reflecting Edward's intention to use the fortress as a base for governing Wales, rather than merely suppressing Welsh resistance. The elaborate Great Hall and private chambers constructed within the castle walls provided accommodations that matched contemporary royal standards, while demonstrating English commitment to permanent occupation. Conwy Castle commanded the strategic river crossing that connected Gwynedd with the rest of Wales, its massive towers and curtain walls creating an impregnable barrier to Welsh movement between their traditional territories. The castle's construction required the destruction of the Cistercian Abbey of Aberconwy, whose monks were relocated to make room for English fortifications. This deliberate elimination of an important Welsh religious centre demonstrated Edward's systematic approach to destroying institutions that might preserve Welsh cultural identity and political aspirations. The town of Conwy, established simultaneously with the castle's construction, illustrated Edward's comprehensive approach to English colonisation of Wales. The new settlement followed a planned layout with streets arranged in a regular grid pattern, surrounded by substantial stone walls that connected with the castle's defences to create an integrated fortified complex. English and foreign settlers received preferential treatment in land grants and commercial privileges, while Welsh inhabitants faced legal restrictions that limited their participation in the town's economic and political life. Harlech Castle occupied a commanding position on the Welsh coast, its elevated location providing visual control over Cardigan Bay, while blocking traditional routes of communication between northern and southern Wales. The castle's design emphasised residential comfort alongside military capability, incorporating sophisticated living quarters that could accommodate the royal court during extended visits to Wales. The fortress's Great Gatehouse served as both a defensive stronghold and a palatial residence, demonstrating the dual military and administrative functions that Edward intended his Welsh castles to fulfil. The construction workforce for Harlech Castle included master masons recruited from the ongoing work at Caernarfon and Conwy, creating consistency in architectural style and defensive capability across Edward's network of Welsh fortifications. Local quarries provided building stone, while timber came from Welsh forests that were systematically harvested to supply construction materials while denying resources to potential Welsh resistance movements. The scale of these construction projects required unprecedented coordination of labour and materials that demonstrated English organisational capabilities while providing employment for Welsh workers who might otherwise have supported resistance activities. Beaumaris Castle represented the culmination of Edward's castle-building programme in Wales, incorporating lessons learned from earlier constructions while demonstrating the most advanced military architecture of the medieval period. The castle's concentric design created multiple lines of defence that could function independently, even if outer walls were breached, while sophisticated sally ports and communication systems enabled the garrison to coordinate complex defensive operations. Construction began in 1295 following the suppression of Madog ap Llywelyn's rebellion, demonstrating Edward's continued commitment to strengthening English control over Wales despite the enormous costs involved. The economic burden of Edward's castle-building programme strained English royal finances while creating employment opportunities that gradually integrated Welsh communities into English economic systems. Master craftsmen earned substantial wages that enabled them to establish permanent residences in Wales, while local workers developed construction skills that could be applied to other projects after castle construction was completed. The sustained demand for building materials stimulated Welsh quarrying, forestry and transportation industries, while creating commercial relationships that linked Welsh producers with English markets. The investiture of Edward's infant son as Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle in 1301 established a precedent that transformed the Welsh princely title from a symbol of independent sovereignty into a designation for the heir to the English throne. The ceremony deliberately incorporated Welsh traditions and symbols while subjecting them to English royal authority, creating a hybrid ritual that acknowledged Welsh identity while denying Welsh political autonomy. The young prince's investiture occurred within the walls of the castle that symbolised English conquest, emphasising the permanent subordination of Welsh aspirations to English imperial authority. The administrative integration of Wales into the English governmental system proceeded gradually through the appointment of English officials to positions previously held by Welsh nobles and clerics. Sheriffs, justices and tax collectors recruited from England replaced traditional Welsh authorities while implementing legal and administrative procedures that followed English models. These appointments created career opportunities for English administrators while ensuring that Welsh territories were governed according to policies determined by English interests rather than local Welsh needs. English settlement patterns in conquered Wales reflected deliberate policies designed to create permanent English populations that could support continued occupation while diluting Welsh demographic dominance. Planned towns like Caernarfon, Conwy and Flint received English and foreign settlers who enjoyed legal privileges and commercial advantages denied to Welsh inhabitants. These colonial communities served as centres for English culture and administration, while providing secure bases for English authority in predominantly Welsh regions. The introduction of English legal procedures fundamentally altered Welsh social relationships by replacing customary law based on kinship and community obligations with common law emphasising individual rights and monetary exchange. Welsh farmers who had traditionally held land through hereditary tenure found themselves subject to English property laws that required written documentation and monetary payments. Many Welsh landholders lost their properties through legal procedures they could not understand or afford to contest, creating opportunities for English colonists to acquire Welsh lands at minimal cost. The marginalisation of Welsh nobility proceeded through a combination of military defeat, legal dispossession, and cultural assimilation that eliminated traditional sources of Welsh political leadership. Welsh nobles who had survived the conquest faced impossible choices between accepting subordinate positions within English administrative systems or maintaining traditional Welsh customs that increasingly lacked legal recognition or economic viability. Many chose collaboration with English authorities as the only means of preserving some portion of their ancestral lands and social status. The transformation of Welsh economic systems under English rule involved the introduction of monetary exchange, standardised weights and measures, and commercial practices that linked Welsh communities with broader English and European markets. Traditional Welsh economic relationships based on reciprocal obligations and seasonal exchanges gave way to market-oriented production focused on generating monetary profits. These changes created new opportunities for some Welsh entrepreneurs while disrupting established patterns of community cooperation and mutual support that had sustained Welsh communities for generations. The legal dispossession of Welsh landholders accelerated during the late 14th century as English administrators refined their techniques for transferring Welsh properties to English settlers. Court proceedings conducted entirely in English and Latin excluded Welsh speakers from effectively defending their land claims, while legal fees and procedural requirements created financial barriers that few Welsh farmers could overcome. The systematic nature of these transfers suggested deliberate policy rather than incidental consequences of legal reform, as English officials consistently interpreted ambiguous cases in favour of English claimants while rejecting Welsh appeals based on traditional tenure practices. Among the Welsh nobles who experienced this systematic dispossession was Owain ap Gruffydd, better known to history as Owain Glyndwr, whose personal grievances against English rule would eventually catalyse the most significant Welsh resistance movement since the Edwardian conquest. Born around 1359 into the noble family of Glyndifrdwy in northeastern Wales, Owain possessed impeccable Welsh genealogical credentials that traced his descent through both paternal and maternal lines to the ancient royal houses of Powys and Deheubarth. His father, Gruffydd Ffychan, had maintained the family's traditional lands through careful accommodation with English authorities, while his mother, Ellen Fyrch Thomas ap Llywelyn, brought additional territorial claims that connected the family to the broader network of displaced Welsh nobility. Owain's early life reflected the complex cultural position of Welsh nobles under English rule, as he received education that combined traditional Welsh learning with the practical skills necessary for advancement within English administrative and military systems. His studies at the Inns of Court in London provided legal training that enabled him to navigate English property law and court procedures, while his service in English military campaigns demonstrated the martial capabilities that had traditionally defined Welsh noble status. This dual education created a generation of Welsh leaders who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of English rule while maintaining emotional connections to Welsh cultural traditions and political aspirations. The specific incident that transformed Owain from a collaborating Welsh nobleman into a revolutionary leader arose from a boundary dispute with his English neighbour Reginald Grey, 3rd Baron Grey de Ruthyn. The conflict began in 1400 when Grey claimed portions of Owain's ancestral lands at Glyndifrdwy, using English legal procedures to challenge Welsh customary tenure that had been recognised for generations. Grey's position as a marcher lord provided him with significant advantages in English courts, while his personal connections to Henry IV's government ensured favourable consideration of his territorial claims regardless of their legal merits. The English legal system's handling of Owain's appeals demonstrated the systematic bias that had made accommodation with English rule increasingly impossible for Welsh landholders. English judges consistently ruled in favour of Grey's claims while rejecting evidence based on Welsh legal traditions and genealogical records that would have supported Owain's position under traditional Welsh law. The court's refusal to recognise Welsh customary tenure effectively declared that centuries of Welsh legal precedent possessed no validity within the English system, eliminating any legal protection for Welsh property rights that conflicted with English territorial ambitions. Grey's seizure of the disputed lands proceeded with the full support of English military and administrative authorities, who provided armed assistance for evicting Welsh tenants while installing English settlers on properties that had been continuously occupied by the same Welsh families for generations. The systematic nature of these evictions, which included the destruction of traditional Welsh buildings and the elimination of Welsh place names, suggested that Grey's territorial ambitions extended beyond simple property acquisition to encompass the complete Anglicisation of the disputed territories. Owain's decision to resort to armed resistance reflected not only his personal frustration with English legal procedures, but also his recognition that the systematic dispossession of Welsh landholders threatened the survival of Welsh cultural and political identity. His initial military actions in September 1400 targeted Grey's properties and supporters, employing traditional Welsh guerrilla tactics that had proven effective against English forces during previous resistance movements. These early attacks demonstrated sophisticated planning and coordination that suggested extensive preparation and the involvement of other displaced Welsh nobles who shared Owain's grievances against English rule. The proclamation of Owain as Prince of Wales by his supporters at Glyndifrdwy on September 16, 1400, represented a direct challenge to English sovereignty that went far beyond the resolution of local property disputes. The ceremony deliberately invoked ancient Welsh traditions of royal inauguration, while rejecting the English claim that the Welsh princely title belonged permanently to the heir to the English throne. Owain's assumption of the title carried profound symbolic significance that resonated throughout Wales, where communities that had experienced similar dispossession and cultural suppression recognised the broader implications of his resistance. The rapid spread of the rebellion beyond Owain's immediate supporters demonstrated the extent of Welsh discontent with English colonial administration. Communities across Wales spontaneously declared their support for Owain's cause while attacking English settlements, officials, and symbols of English authority. The simultaneous nature of these uprisings suggested that Welsh resentment had reached levels that required minimal coordination to produce widespread resistance, indicating that Owain's personal grievances reflected broader patterns of English oppression that affected Welsh society at all levels. Welsh students at Oxford University abandoned their studies to join Owain's rebellion, demonstrating that even Welsh individuals who had achieved success within English educational systems remained fundamentally alienated from English rule. These educated Welsh supporters brought valuable skills in administration, communication, and military organisation that enabled the rebellion to develop sophisticated governmental structures alongside its military operations. Their participation also indicated that Welsh resistance transcended simple peasant unrest to encompass a broad cross-section of Welsh society, united by shared cultural identity and political aspirations. The English government's initial response to Owain's rebellion revealed both the strengths and limitations of English administrative control over Wales. Henry IV possessed substantial military resources and experienced commanders who had proven their capabilities in suppressing English rebellions and conducting foreign campaigns. However, the king's precarious position on the English throne, which he had seized from Richard II in 1399, limited his ability to commit extensive resources to Welsh campaigns while facing potential challenges from other English nobles and foreign enemies. Parliamentary legislation enacted in response to the Welsh rebellion demonstrated English determination to suppress Welsh resistance through systematic legal persecution that extended far beyond military operations. The penal laws against the Welsh, first enacted in 1401 and subsequently expanded, created comprehensive legal disabilities that affected every aspect of Welsh life. These laws prohibited Welsh individuals from holding land in English boroughs, carrying arms, or occupying positions of authority, while requiring English residents in Wales to report any suspicious Welsh activities to English officials. The systematic nature of the penal laws revealed English recognition that military conquest alone could not guarantee permanent control over Wales without the elimination of Welsh cultural and political institutions that might support future resistance movements. The laws specifically targeted Welsh language use in legal proceedings, Welsh customary law practices, and Welsh educational traditions, aiming to destroy the cultural foundations that sustained Welsh identity and political aspirations. English officials received instructions to enforce these laws rigorously, while encouraging English settlement in Wales through preferential treatment and legal privileges. Owain's military campaigns during 1401 and 1402 demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated Welsh resistance when supported by popular enthusiasm and competent leadership. His forces achieved significant victories at Mynydd Heidgen in 1401, where Welsh infantry formations successfully defeated English cavalry through superior knowledge of local terrain and innovative tactical arrangements. The battle demonstrated that Welsh forces could match English military capabilities when fighting on favourable ground, with adequate preparation and coordination. The victory at Mynydd Heidgen provided Owain's rebellion with crucial momentum, while demonstrating Welsh military potential to audiences throughout Britain and Europe. The defeat of experienced English forces by Welsh rebels challenged assumptions about English military superiority, while encouraging additional Welsh communities to join the resistance. The battle's psychological impact proved as significant as its immediate military consequences, as news of Welsh success spread rapidly through networks of Welsh students, merchants and clerics who maintained communication across political boundaries. Owain's capture of major English strongholds during 1403 and 1404 marked the rebellion's transformation from localised resistance into a comprehensive challenge to English authority throughout Wales. The systematic reduction of English castles required sophisticated siege techniques and substantial military resources that indicated the rebellion's evolution into a well-organised military and political movement. Welsh forces demonstrated their ability to conduct complex military operations that matched contemporary European standards, while maintaining the mobility and local knowledge that had traditionally characterised Welsh warfare. The capture of Harlech Castle in 1404 provided Owain with a secure base for establishing the governmental institutions necessary for administering an independent Welsh state. The castle's strategic position and formidable defences created a symbol of Welsh military success, while providing practical facilities for royal administration, diplomatic negotiations, and military planning. Owain's establishment of his court at Harlech demonstrated his intention to create permanent governmental structures rather than merely conducting temporary military resistance. The siege and capture of Aberystwyth Castle further demonstrated Welsh military capabilities while providing control over the strategic central Welsh coastline. The successful assault required coordinated operations by land and sea forces that indicated sophisticated military organisation and substantial resources. Welsh control of both Harlech and Aberystwyth created a secure territorial base that enabled Owain to pursue diplomatic initiatives with foreign powers while maintaining effective military resistance against English attempts at reconquest. Owain's vision for an independent Welsh state encompassed comprehensive political, educational and religious reforms that would restore Welsh cultural autonomy while incorporating contemporary European governmental innovations. His plans for establishing Welsh universities reflected understanding that cultural independence required educational institutions capable of training Welsh administrators, lawyers and clerics according to Welsh traditions and needs. The proposed universities would have provided alternatives to English educational institutions while preserving Welsh intellectual traditions that English colonial policies sought to eliminate. The educational programme envisioned by Owain emphasised the restoration of Welsh language instruction, alongside Latin and other scholarly languages necessary for participation in European intellectual life. Welsh students would have received training in law, theology, medicine and natural philosophy, according to curricula, that incorporated Welsh historical and cultural materials while meeting contemporary academic standards. These institutions would have created Welsh intellectual elites capable of governing an independent Welsh state while maintaining cultural connections to broader European scholarly communities. Owain's plans for an independent Welsh church reflected his understanding that religious autonomy was essential for maintaining Welsh cultural identity against English colonial pressure. The proposed ecclesiastical arrangements would have established Welsh archbishops independent of Canterbury's authority, while maintaining communion with Rome and other European churches. This religious independence would have enabled Welsh clerics to conduct services in Welsh, preserve Welsh liturgical traditions, and train Welsh priests according to Welsh cultural needs, rather than English colonial requirements. The diplomatic initiatives pursued by Owain demonstrated sophisticated understanding of European political relationships and the potential for creating anti-English coalitions that could support Welsh independence. His negotiations with France reflected recognition that French hostility toward England created opportunities for Welsh resistance to receive foreign military and financial support. The formal alliance concluded with France in 1404 provided Owain with international recognition of his royal status, while establishing the legal foundation for French military assistance to Welsh forces. French support for Owain's rebellion included substantial military assistance that significantly enhanced Welsh military capabilities while demonstrating European recognition of Welsh independence claims. French expeditionary forces brought advanced siege equipment, professional military expertise, and financial resources that enabled Welsh forces to conduct more ambitious military operations than would have been possible using only indigenous resources. The presence of French forces in Wales also provided diplomatic legitimacy for Owain's governmental claims, while encouraging other European powers to consider recognition of Welsh independence. The alliance with Scotland created additional pressure on English resources, while providing Welsh forces with potential military support from experienced Scottish armies. Scottish recognition of Owain's royal title established important diplomatic precedents, while creating coordination opportunities between Welsh and Scottish resistance movements that could threaten English territorial control from multiple directions simultaneously. The tripartite alliance between Wales, Scotland and France represented the most serious diplomatic challenge to English territorial integrity since the Norman conquest. Owain's administrative achievements during the height of his rebellion demonstrated Welsh capabilities for effective governmental organisation that could have sustained long-term political independence. His establishment of chancery operations, legal courts and tax collection systems created functional governmental institutions that operated according to Welsh customary law, while incorporating contemporary European administrative innovations. These achievements indicated that Welsh political independence was practically feasible rather than merely representing romantic aspirations unsupported by administrative reality. The legal system established under Owain's authority restored Welsh customary law, while adapting traditional procedures to contemporary governmental needs. Welsh judges trained in both traditional Welsh legal principles and contemporary European jurisprudence administered justice according to procedures that recognised Welsh cultural values while meeting practical requirements for dispute resolution and criminal prosecution. This legal restoration provided Welsh communities with alternatives to English legal systems that had systematically favoured English interests over Welsh rights. The gradual suppression of Owain's rebellion reflected English determination to maintain colonial control over Wales, regardless of the military and financial costs involved. Henry IV's systematic approach to reconquest combined military pressure with diplomatic initiatives designed to divide Welsh support for Owain, while encouraging defections among his supporters. English forces avoided the pitched battles that had previously favoured Welsh tactical advantages, instead pursuing strategies of economic warfare that gradually reduced the resources available for sustaining Welsh resistance. The English strategy of systematic devastation targeted Welsh agricultural production, commercial activities, and population centres that provided support for Owain's military operations. English forces deliberately destroyed crops, livestock, and agricultural infrastructure, while preventing Welsh communities from conducting normal economic activities. This approach aimed at creating conditions that would make continued resistance economically unsustainable while forcing Welsh populations to choose between supporting Owain's cause and ensuring their basic survival. The recapture of Harlech Castle in 1409 effectively ended Owain Glyndwr's capacity to maintain organised resistance, though the prince himself vanished into the Welsh mountains, where local communities continued to shelter him, despite substantial English rewards for his capture. His disappearance into legend marked not the restoration of English colonial control, but rather the beginning of a different phase in Welsh-English relations, as the rebellion's failure demonstrated that military resistance alone could not achieve Welsh political independence, while simultaneously revealing the depth of Welsh cultural identity that no amount of English administrative pressure could completely eliminate. The aftermath of Glyndwr's rebellion witnessed intensified English efforts to prevent future Welsh uprisings through systematic policies designed to integrate Welsh territories more completely into English governmental and economic systems. The penal laws remained in effect, creating legal disabilities that affected every aspect of Welsh life, while encouraging English settlement through preferential treatment in land grants, commercial privileges, and administrative appointments. These policies reflected English recognition that military conquest required reinforcement through demographic and cultural transformation that would gradually reduce Welsh capacity for organised resistance. Welsh society during the 15th century adapted to these constraints through complex strategies that combined outward accommodation with English rule and covert preservation of Welsh cultural traditions. Welsh nobles who had survived the rebellion and its aftermath faced impossible choices between complete assimilation into English colonial society or marginalisation that would eliminate their capacity to protect Welsh communities under their authority. Many chose pragmatic collaboration that enabled them to maintain some influence while secretly supporting Welsh cultural preservation through patronage of Welsh poets, musicians and traditional craftsmen. The emergence of the Tudor dynasty from this environment of cultural suppression and political accommodation represented one of history's most remarkable reversals of fortune. Henry Tudor's grandfather, Owen Tudor, had served as a court official to Queen Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, before secretly marrying her in violation of English laws that prohibited such unions without royal permission. This clandestine marriage connected the Tudor family to English royal bloodlines, while maintaining their Welsh origins and cultural connections that would prove crucial for their eventual rise to political prominence. Owen Tudor's execution in 1461, following the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, demonstrated the precarious position of Welsh families who had achieved prominence within English political systems. His death at the hands of Yorkist forces reflected the broader instability of 15th century English politics, where competing dynastic claims created opportunities for ambitious families while simultaneously threatening their survival when political circumstances shifted. The Tudor family's survival of this crisis and their eventual triumph represented not only personal resilience, but also the persistence of Welsh political ambitions despite centuries of English colonial domination. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, inherited his father's political connections while adding his own diplomatic and military capabilities that positioned the Tudor family as significant players in English dynastic politics. His marriage to Margaret Beaufort brought additional royal connections through her descent from John of Gaunt, creating genealogical claims that would later provide legal justification for Tudor assertions of royal authority. These strategic marriages reflected sophisticated understanding of English political systems while maintaining Welsh cultural identity that would influence Tudor policies toward Wales throughout their dynastic reign. Henry Tudor's birth at Pembroke Castle in 1457 occurred during a period of particular instability, when Yorkist victories had forced Lancastrian supporters to seek refuge in remote Welsh strongholds. His early childhood in Wales provided intimate knowledge of Welsh society, language, and cultural traditions that distinguished him from other English royal claimants who possessed only theoretical connections to Welsh territories. This Welsh upbringing created emotional bonds that would influence Henry's later policies, while providing him with networks of Welsh supporters who viewed his success as an opportunity for Welsh political rehabilitation. The political circumstances that enabled Henry Tudor's invasion of England in 1485 reflected broader European diplomatic developments that created opportunities for challenging Yorkist rule through foreign military intervention. French support for Henry's expedition provided not only financial resources and military equipment, but also international legitimacy that encouraged English opponents of Richard III to consider supporting the Tudor claimant. Henry's ability to secure French backing demonstrated diplomatic skills that complemented his military capabilities, while indicating European recognition of his potential for successful conquest. Henry's landing at Millbay near Dale in Pembrokeshire on August 7, 1485, marked the beginning of the most successful Welsh military campaign since Owain Glyndwr's early victories. The choice of landing site reflected strategic calculation based on intimate knowledge of Welsh geography and political conditions, as Pembrokeshire contained substantial numbers of Welsh families who retained loyalty to the Tudor cause despite decades of English colonial pressure. The successful landing also demonstrated Henry's understanding that Welsh support would be crucial for his campaign's success, as he lacked the extensive English territorial base that had supported previous dynastic claimants. The march from Pembrokeshire to Bosworth Field became a triumphant progress through Wales, as communities that had suffered under Yorkist rule welcomed Henry as a liberating Welsh prince, rather than merely another English dynastic claimant. Welsh poets and chroniclers described the march in terms that deliberately invoked ancient Welsh prophecies about the return of a Welsh king who would restore Welsh political prominence and cultural autonomy. These prophecies, which had sustained Welsh hopes during the darkest periods of English colonial rule, suddenly appeared to be achieving fulfilment through Henry's remarkable military success. Welsh military support for Henry's campaign provided crucial reinforcement that transformed a risky foreign invasion into a viable challenge to established royal authority. Welsh archers, whose skills had been honed through generations of resistance warfare, brought superior marksmanship capabilities that would prove decisive at Bosworth Field. Welsh infantry formations, trained in the guerrilla tactics that had characterised Welsh military tradition, provided tactical flexibility that complemented Henry's French and English supporters, while demonstrating continued Welsh military effectiveness, despite decades of English attempts at disarmament. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22nd, 1485, witnessed the convergence of Welsh military tradition with contemporary European warfare in ways that demonstrated the evolution of Welsh tactical capabilities since Glyndwr's rebellion. Welsh longbowmen, positioned to exploit their superior range and accuracy, dominated the initial phases of the battle, while Welsh infantry formations provided crucial support during the decisive cavalry charges that determined the battle's outcome. The death of Richard III under Welsh arrows symbolically completed the reversal of fortune that had begun with Henry's landing in Pembrokeshire just 2 weeks earlier. Henry's coronation as Henry VII marked not only the establishment of a new English dynasty, but also the first time since the Edwardian conquest that a Welsh prince had achieved supreme political authority in Britain. The symbolic significance of this achievement resonated throughout Wales, where communities that had endured centuries of colonial domination suddenly found themselves ruled by a king who spoke Welsh, understood Welsh cultural traditions, and possessed genuine emotional connections to Welsh political aspirations. The psychological impact of Henry's success proved as significant as its immediate political consequences, restoring Welsh confidence while demonstrating that accommodation with English political systems could achieve objectives that military resistance had failed to accomplish. The early policies of Henry VII toward Wales reflected his sophisticated understanding of the political challenges involved in governing territories where his dynastic claims depended partly on Welsh support, while his royal authority required acceptance by English political elites who remained suspicious of Welsh influence. Henry's approach combined symbolic recognition of Welsh cultural identity with practical measures designed to integrate Welsh territories more completely into unified governmental systems. This balance required constant diplomatic skill to maintain Welsh loyalty, while avoiding English accusations of favouritism that could undermine his broader political authority. Henry's appointment of Welsh officials to positions of authority within English governmental systems represented a dramatic reversal of previous English policies that had systematically excluded Welsh individuals from administrative responsibilities. These appointments provided Welsh families with opportunities for advancement that had been denied for centuries, while creating networks of Welsh influence within English institutions. However, Henry carefully balanced these appointments with continued reliance on English administrators, whose loyalty was essential for maintaining political stability throughout his realms. The gradual relaxation of the penal laws during Henry's reign reflected his recognition that systematic legal persecution of Welsh populations was incompatible with his dependence on Welsh political support. The king's policies enabled Welsh individuals to recover properties that had been confiscated during previous periods of rebellion, while restoring legal rights that had been denied since Glyndwr's uprising. These reforms proceeded cautiously to avoid English accusations of excessive favouritism while providing tangible benefits that reinforced Welsh loyalty to the Tudor dynasty. Henry's patronage of Welsh cultural activities demonstrated his personal commitment to preserving Welsh traditions while adapting them to contemporary political circumstances. Royal support for Welsh poets, musicians and chroniclers provided resources for cultural preservation that had been lacking during the previous century of English colonial domination. This patronage also served political purposes by encouraging Welsh cultural figures to celebrate Tudor achievements while maintaining traditional forms that preserved Welsh cultural identity within the broader framework of English political authority. The marriage of Henry's son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon in 1501 represented the Tudor dynasty's successful integration into European royal networks, while maintaining their distinctive Welsh cultural heritage. The elaborate wedding ceremonies at St Paul's Cathedral demonstrated Tudor wealth and political sophistication, while providing opportunities for displaying Welsh cultural traditions to European diplomatic audiences. Arthur's subsequent establishment at Ludlow Castle as Prince of Wales created a Welsh royal court that combined English administrative efficiency with Welsh cultural traditions in ways that suggested potential models for future governmental arrangements. Arthur's premature death in 1502 eliminated the heir who had been specifically prepared for governing Wales, according to arrangements that balanced English administrative requirements with Welsh cultural expectations. His death forced Henry VII to reconsider succession arrangements while dealing with the broader implications of losing the prince who had been intended to embody the successful fusion of Welsh and English political traditions. The crisis demonstrated the fragility of dynastic arrangements that depended on specific individuals while highlighting the continued importance of Welsh support for Tudor political survival. Henry VIII's accession in 1509 brought to the throne a king whose Welsh ancestry was equally authentic, but whose cultural formation had been entirely English, creating different dynamics in Welsh-English relations. The new king possessed theoretical understanding of Welsh political importance for Tudor dynastic security, while lacking the emotional connections and cultural knowledge that had informed his father's policies. This generational change would prove crucial for subsequent developments in Welsh-English relations, as Henry VIII pursued policies that prioritised administrative efficiency over cultural accommodation. The early years of Henry VIII's reign witnessed continued Tudor patronage of Welsh cultural activities, while gradually shifting emphasis toward more systematic integration of Welsh territories into unified English governmental systems. The king maintained royal support for Welsh poets and chroniclers, while beginning to implement administrative reforms that would reduce Welsh institutional autonomy in favour of standardised procedures applied throughout his realms. These changes reflected broader trends in European governmental development that emphasised centralised authority over traditional regional autonomy. Henry VIII's break with Rome created new opportunities for implementing comprehensive administrative reforms that had been previously constrained by ecclesiastical opposition and traditional legal protections. The elimination of papal authority over English territories removed external constraints on royal legislative power, while providing justifications for seizing church properties that could finance governmental expansion. These developments created the political and economic resources necessary for implementing the systematic integration of Welsh territories that would culminate in the Acts of Union. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 demonstrated English resistance to Henry VIII's religious and administrative innovations, while providing Welsh communities with examples of successful opposition to royal policies that threatened traditional institutional arrangements. However, Welsh responses to these developments differed significantly from English reactions, as Welsh communities generally supported Tudor policies that promised to eliminate the legal disabilities and administrative discrimination that had characterised English colonial rule. This divergence reflected the different historical experiences of Welsh and English populations under Tudor governance. The first Act of Union, passed by the English Parliament in 1536, represented the culmination of Tudor policies toward Wales, while establishing legal frameworks that would govern Welsh-English relations for the next 4 centuries. The Act's provisions formally incorporated Welsh territories into the English kingdom, while establishing administrative and legal systems that promised equal treatment for Welsh and English populations. However, the Act's implementation required the elimination of Welsh legal traditions, governmental institutions, and linguistic practices that had preserved Welsh cultural identity throughout centuries of English colonial domination. The administrative provisions of the 1536 Act created English-style county governments throughout Wales, while establishing English legal procedures that replaced traditional Welsh customary law. These changes promised more efficient governmental operations while eliminating the institutional foundations that had sustained Welsh cultural autonomy. Welsh communities gained access to English legal protections and commercial opportunities while losing the traditional institutions that had preserved their distinctive cultural identity and political traditions. The linguistic requirements established by the Act of Union mandated the use of English in all official proceedings, while effectively prohibiting Welsh language use in legal, administrative, and educational contexts. These provisions reflected contemporary assumptions about the necessity of linguistic uniformity for effective governmental operations while demonstrating English determination to eliminate cultural differences that might sustain Welsh political separatism. The language requirements would prove to be among the most controversial and long-lasting consequences of the Union settlement. The Second Act of Union in 1543 refined and expanded the administrative arrangements established by the earlier legislation, while addressing practical problems that had emerged during the initial implementation period. The later Act provided more detailed procedures for local government operations, while establishing educational and legal institutions that would complete the integration of Welsh territories into English governmental systems. These refinements demonstrated Tudor commitment to making the Union settlement permanent, while addressing Welsh concerns about the practical implementation of the new arrangements. The establishment of the Court of Great Sessions provided Welsh territories with specialised legal institutions that combined English legal procedures with recognition of Welsh geographical and cultural circumstances. This compromise arrangement enabled Welsh communities to access English legal protections while maintaining some institutional distinctiveness that acknowledged their particular needs and traditions. The court's operations would prove crucial for the successful implementation of the Union settlement, while providing models for accommodating regional differences within unified governmental systems. The economic consequences of the Acts of Union created new opportunities for Welsh participation in English and European commercial networks, while disrupting traditional Welsh economic relationships based on kinship obligations and seasonal exchanges. Welsh agricultural producers gained access to English markets, while Welsh craftsmen could compete for contracts throughout the expanded kingdom. However, these opportunities required adaptation to English commercial practices and legal procedures that many Welsh communities found difficult to navigate successfully. The social transformation accompanying political union involved the gradual emergence of a Welsh gentry class that combined traditional Welsh cultural identity with successful participation in English political and economic systems. These families maintained Welsh genealogical pride, while adopting English educational practices, commercial methods, and political strategies that enabled them to achieve prominence within the unified kingdom. Their success provided models for other Welsh families while creating new forms of Welsh cultural expression that adapted traditional elements to contemporary circumstances. The Protestant Reformation's impact on Wales proceeded through the systematic replacement of Catholic religious institutions with Protestant alternatives that emphasise vernacular religious instruction and popular participation in religious activities. The dissolution of Welsh monasteries eliminated important centres of Welsh cultural preservation, while providing opportunities for establishing new educational institutions that could serve Welsh communities according to Protestant principles. These changes fundamentally altered Welsh religious life, while creating new possibilities for Welsh cultural development within Protestant frameworks. William Salisbury emerged as the most significant figure in adapting Protestant religious principles to Welsh cultural circumstances through his scholarly work in translating religious texts into Welsh, while developing standardised orthographic systems that could preserve Welsh linguistic traditions within Protestant religious contexts. His translation of the New Testament in 1567 provided Welsh communities with access to Protestant religious instruction in their native language, while demonstrating that Welsh cultural preservation was compatible with religious reform. Salisbury's work established precedents for Welsh cultural adaptation that would influence subsequent developments throughout the Tudor period. The educational innovations accompanying religious reform created new opportunities for Welsh intellectual development, while requiring adaptation to Protestant theological principles and English administrative practices. The establishment of grammar schools in Welsh market towns provided educational opportunities that had previously been available only through monastic institutions, while introducing Welsh students to classical learning and contemporary European intellectual developments. These schools produced educated Welsh individuals who could participate successfully in English political, legal, and commercial activities while maintaining their Welsh cultural identity. William Morgan's translation of the complete Bible into Welsh in 1588 represented the culmination of Protestant efforts to provide Welsh communities with vernacular religious instruction while preserving Welsh linguistic traditions within reformed religious frameworks. Morgan's translation work required sophisticated understanding of both Welsh literary traditions and contemporary Protestant theology, creating a Welsh religious text that maintained linguistic authenticity while conveying reformed theological principles. The availability of the complete Welsh Bible ensured that Protestant religious instruction could proceed in Welsh while providing a literary standard that would influence Welsh cultural development for centuries. The cultural significance of Morgan's Welsh Bible extended far beyond its immediate religious purposes, as the translation provided Welsh communities with a prestigious literary text that demonstrated the continued vitality and sophistication of Welsh linguistic traditions. The Bible's publication coincided with broader European developments in vernacular literature that emphasized the cultural value of national languages while providing practical tools for popular education and cultural development. Morgan's achievement proved that Welsh cultural preservation was compatible with participation in contemporary European intellectual and religious movements. The emergence of Welsh humanist scholarship during the later Tudor period reflected the successful adaptation of Welsh intellectual traditions to contemporary European learning while maintaining distinctive Welsh cultural characteristics. Welsh scholars like John Davies of Malwyd combined classical learning with Welsh antiquarian research, creating scholarly works that demonstrated Welsh cultural sophistication while contributing to broader European intellectual development. These achievements provided evidence that political union with England could enhance rather than diminish Welsh cultural accomplishments when properly managed and supported. The development of Welsh antiquarian studies during this period reflected growing Welsh confidence in their cultural heritage while demonstrating sophisticated understanding of historical methodology and scholarly research techniques. Welsh scholars investigated their genealogical traditions, legal customs, and literary heritage using contemporary European scholarly methods, while maintaining pride in their distinctive cultural achievements. This scholarly work provided intellectual foundations for continued Welsh cultural identity, while demonstrating successful adaptation to contemporary European intellectual standards. The transformation of Welsh bardic traditions during the Tudor period illustrated the complex processes of cultural adaptation that characterised Welsh responses to political union with England. Traditional Welsh poetry evolved to incorporate new themes and techniques while maintaining essential characteristics that preserved Welsh cultural identity. Welsh poets celebrated Tudor achievements while maintaining traditional forms and cultural references that sustained Welsh cultural continuity despite fundamental changes in political and social circumstances. This cultural resilience would prove crucial as Wales entered the 17th century facing new religious movements that would fundamentally reshape Welsh society and identity. The accession of James I in 1603 brought to the throne a monarch whose Presbyterian Scottish background created different dynamics in religious policy compared to his Tudor predecessors. While maintaining the established Anglican church structure, James's reign witnessed the emergence of more diverse Protestant movements that found fertile ground among Welsh communities seeking authentic spiritual experiences beyond the formal ceremonies of state-sponsored religion. The king's scholarly interests and theological sophistication encouraged religious debate that inadvertently provided space for the development of alternative Protestant traditions that would transform Welsh religious life. Welsh Puritanism emerged during the early 17th century as educated Welsh clergy and laypeople sought more rigorous applications of Protestant theological principles than they found in the established church. These Welsh Puritans maintained loyalty to the Church of England while advocating for reforms that would eliminate remaining Catholic ceremonial elements and emphasise personal spiritual experience over institutional authority. Their approach combined traditional Welsh emphasis on individual spiritual responsibility with contemporary Protestant theological developments, creating distinctive forms of Welsh religious expression. The influence of Welsh Puritan clergy extended far beyond their immediate congregations, as they established networks of correspondence and mutual support that connected Welsh communities with broader English and European Protestant movements. Ministers like Walter Craddock and Vavasor Powell developed reputations for powerful preaching that attracted audiences from across Wales while maintaining scholarly engagement with contemporary theological developments. Their sermons emphasised personal conversion experiences and practical Christian living in ways that resonated with Welsh cultural values while introducing new forms of religious expression. The Civil War period created unprecedented opportunities for Welsh religious innovation, as the collapse of traditional ecclesiastical authority enabled the emergence of independent congregations that operated according to their own theological convictions. Welsh communities that had previously been constrained by Anglican uniformity requirements suddenly found themselves free to experiment with alternative forms of worship, church governance, and theological interpretation. This religious freedom produced remarkable diversity in Welsh Protestant expression, while establishing precedents for religious autonomy that would influence Welsh Christianity for centuries. Baptist churches appeared in Wales during the 1640s as Welsh communities embraced believers' baptism and congregational church governance that emphasised local autonomy over hierarchical ecclesiastical control. The first Welsh Baptist congregation, established at Ilston in Gower around 1649, represented a radical departure from traditional Anglican parish structures while maintaining essential Protestant theological principles. These early Baptist communities attracted members from diverse social backgrounds who shared commitment to adult baptism and democratic church governance that reflected broader democratic impulses of the revolutionary period. The theological principles underlying Welsh Baptist development emphasised individual spiritual experience and congregational autonomy in ways that complemented traditional Welsh cultural values regarding personal responsibility and community self-governance. Baptist rejection of infant baptism required adult conversion experiences that created more intentional Christian communities, while their congregational polity enabled local churches to adapt their practices to Welsh cultural circumstances. These innovations proved particularly attractive to Welsh communities that valued both spiritual authenticity and cultural autonomy. Independent congregations, also known as Congregationalists, emerged simultaneously with Baptist churches while maintaining different theological positions regarding baptism and church membership. Welsh independents emphasised the autonomy of local congregations while practising infant baptism and maintaining more inclusive membership policies than their Baptist counterparts. Their theological approach combined Calvinist doctrinal positions with democratic church governance that enabled Welsh communities to maintain Protestant orthodoxy while exercising local religious autonomy. The proliferation of independent churches throughout Wales during the interregnum reflected the movement's successful adaptation to Welsh social and cultural circumstances. Independent ministers like Morgan Llwyd combined scholarly theological training with passionate preaching styles that appealed to Welsh audiences while maintaining connections to broader English and European Protestant networks. These churches provided Welsh communities with religious institutions that satisfied their spiritual needs while preserving cultural distinctiveness within Protestant frameworks. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought renewed pressure for religious conformity that threatened the independent Protestant churches that had flourished during the Commonwealth period. The Act of Uniformity in 1662 required all ministers to accept Anglican ordination and liturgical practices, forcing Welsh Puritan clergy to choose between conformity and ejection from their parishes. Approximately 120 Welsh ministers chose ejection rather than compromise their theological convictions, creating a substantial body of displaced clergy who would become leaders in developing Welsh nonconformist traditions. These ejected ministers established the foundation for organised Welsh nonconformity through their continued preaching and pastoral activities despite legal prohibitions and official persecution. Operating through Llandudno and Destun networks that connected Welsh communities across geographical and denominational boundaries, these ministers maintained Protestant traditions that emphasised personal spiritual experience and congregational autonomy. Their activities created underground religious networks that would emerge as powerful forces in Welsh religious life when legal toleration was eventually achieved. The Toleration Act of 1689 provided legal protection for Protestant dissenters while maintaining Anglican establishment, creating the legal framework within which Welsh nonconformist churches could operate openly and establish permanent institutional structures. This legislation enabled Welsh Baptist, Independent and Presbyterian congregations to construct meeting houses, ordain ministers, and conduct public worship without fear of legal persecution. The immediate response demonstrated the extent of Welsh commitment to nonconformist principles as communities throughout Wales established chapels and called ministers to serve congregations that had maintained their existence through decades of legal disability. Welsh chapel construction during the late 17th and early 18th centuries reflected both the growing prosperity of nonconformist communities and their commitment to creating distinctive architectural expressions of their theological principles. These buildings typically featured simple rectangular designs that emphasized preaching over ceremonial worship, with prominent pulpits positioned to ensure that all congregants could hear clearly. The absence of elaborate decoration or liturgical furniture reflected nonconformist theological emphasis on spiritual rather than ceremonial worship while creating distinctively Welsh religious architecture. The social composition of Welsh nonconformist congregations revealed the movement's broad appeal across different economic and educational levels of Welsh society. While attracting substantial support from Welsh farmers, craftsmen, and small merchants, nonconformist churches also included educated professionals and even some members of the Welsh gentry who found their theological principles and worship styles more satisfying than Anglican alternatives. This social diversity strengthened nonconformist communities while creating networks of mutual support that transcended traditional social boundaries. The emergence of Methodist revival in 18th century Wales represented the most significant religious transformation since the Protestant Reformation, creating new forms of Protestant spirituality that would fundamentally reshape Welsh cultural identity. The Methodist movement began not as a separate denomination, but as a renewal movement within the Church of England that emphasised personal conversion experiences, emotional worship, and practical Christian living. However, Methodist innovations in preaching techniques, organisational methods, and spiritual practices proved so attractive to Welsh communities that the movement quickly developed distinctive Welsh characteristics. Howell Harris emerged as the most significant early leader of Welsh Methodism through his powerful preaching and innovative organisational abilities that created the institutional framework for Methodist expansion throughout Wales. Born in 1714 at Trevecca in Breconshire, Harris experienced a dramatic conversion in 1735 that transformed him from a conventional Anglican layman into a passionate evangelist whose preaching attracted enormous audiences across Wales. His conversion experience, which occurred while receiving communion at Talgarth Church, involved intense emotional and spiritual phenomena that would characterise Methodist spirituality throughout its development. Harris's preaching style combined theological sophistication with emotional intensity that proved remarkably effective in attracting Welsh audiences who who had found traditional Anglican worship insufficient for their spiritual needs. His sermons emphasized the necessity of personal conversion experiences while describing the emotional and psychological transformations that accompanied genuine Christian faith. Harris possessed exceptional oratorical abilities that enabled him to maintain audience attention for hours while conveying complex theological concepts through vivid imagery and practical applications that resonated with Welsh cultural values. The organisational innovations developed by Harris created the administrative framework that enabled Methodist expansion, while maintaining doctrinal consistency and pastoral oversight across widely scattered congregations. His system of societies, classes and bands provided multiple levels of religious fellowship that could accommodate different spiritual needs, while ensuring that Methodist converts received continued instruction and pastoral care. These organisational structures proved remarkably adaptable to Welsh social circumstances, while creating networks of mutual support that strengthened Methodist communities against external opposition. Daniel Rowland's ministry at Llangitho transformed that small Cardiganshire parish into the unofficial capital of Welsh Methodism, while demonstrating the movement's capacity for creating intense spiritual experiences that attracted participants from across Wales. Rowland, who experienced his own conversion in 1737 after hearing Harris preach, developed preaching techniques that combined careful biblical exposition with emotional appeals that produced remarkable responses among his audiences. His monthly communion services at Llangitho attracted thousands of participants who travelled considerable distances to experience the powerful spiritual atmosphere that characterised his ministry. The phenomena that occurred during Rowland's services included physical manifestations of spiritual experience that contemporary observers found both remarkable and controversial. Participants frequently experienced intense emotional responses that included weeping, shouting, and physical convulsions that Methodist leaders interpreted as evidence of genuine spiritual transformation. Critics dismissed these manifestations as emotional excess or deliberate deception, but their consistency and the lasting behavioural changes they produced among participants suggested authentic spiritual experiences that transcended mere emotional manipulation. Rowland's theological approach emphasised the experiential aspects of Christian faith while maintaining orthodox Protestant doctrinal positions that connected Welsh Methodism with broader evangelical movements throughout Britain and Europe. His preaching focused on the necessity of personal conversion while describing the assurance of salvation that could result from authentic faith experiences. This theological combination proved particularly attractive to Welsh audiences who valued both intellectual rigour and emotional authenticity in their religious experiences. William Williams' Pantycelyn emerged as the most significant literary figure of Welsh Methodism through his hymns and prose works that provided theological and devotional resources for Methodist communities throughout Wales. Born in 1717 near Landovery, Williams experienced conversion under Harris's preaching in 1738, before developing his own ministry that combined pastoral care with literary production. His writings created a distinctively Welsh Methodist literature that expressed Methodist theological principles through Welsh poetic traditions, while providing practical guidance for Christian living. Williams's hymns revolutionised Welsh religious expression by creating vernacular sacred music that combined Methodist theological themes with traditional Welsh poetic techniques. His compositions provided Welsh Methodist congregations with songs that expressed their spiritual experiences while maintaining connection to Welsh cultural traditions. The popularity of Williams's hymns extended far beyond Methodist circles, as their literary quality and spiritual depth attracted appreciation from Welsh communities regardless of their denominational affiliations. The theological content of Williams's literary works demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Protestant doctrine combined with practical wisdom regarding Christian spiritual development. His prose writings provided Methodist converts with guidance for understanding their spiritual experiences while offering practical advice for maintaining Christian commitment amid the challenges of daily life. Williams's ability to combine theological depth with accessible expression made his works invaluable resources for Welsh Methodist communities that often lacked formally trained clergy. The organisational development of Welsh Methodism proceeded through the creation of associations that coordinated Methodist activities across Wales while maintaining connection with English Methodist leadership under John Wesley's direction. These associations provided administrative oversight for local societies while facilitating communication between scattered Methodist communities. The association system enabled Welsh Methodism to maintain doctrinal consistency while adapting Methodist practices to Welsh cultural circumstances and geographical challenges. The relationship between Welsh Methodism and the established Church of England remained complex throughout the 18th century, as Methodist leaders maintained their Anglican ordination while developing practices that increasingly diverged from traditional Anglican worship. This tension created ongoing controversies regarding Methodist legitimacy, while enabling the movement to attract participants who might have been reluctant to join overtly dissenting churches. The eventual separation of Methodism from the Church of England occurred gradually through a series of practical decisions rather than dramatic theological conflicts. Welsh Methodist emphasis on lay preaching created opportunities for ordinary Welsh men and women to exercise religious leadership while developing their intellectual and oratorical abilities. Methodist societies encourage members to participate in religious discussions and provide mutual spiritual guidance that developed leadership skills among people who would have had no opportunities for such development within traditional Anglican structures. This democratisation of religious authority proved particularly significant in Welsh communities where traditional social hierarchies had limited opportunities for personal advancement. The impact of Methodist revival on Welsh cultural life extended far beyond strictly religious concerns, as Methodist emphasis on education, moral improvement, and social responsibility influenced broader patterns of Welsh social development. Methodist societies established schools, libraries, and mutual aid organisations that provided practical benefits, while promoting values that would shape Welsh community life for generations. The movement's emphasis on personal responsibility and moral improvement complemented traditional Welsh cultural values while providing new institutional frameworks for their expression. The industrial transformation of Wales began during the mid-18th century as entrepreneurs recognised the commercial potential of Welsh mineral resources that had been exploited on small scales for centuries. The convergence of abundant iron ore, coal deposits, limestone and water power in South Wales created ideal conditions for iron production using new technological innovations that dramatically increased output while reducing production costs. These developments attracted substantial capital investment from English and Welsh entrepreneurs who established ironworks that would transform Welsh society and economy. The Dowlais Ironworks, established near Merthyr Tydfil in 1759, represented the beginning of large-scale industrial development in Wales through its systematic exploitation of local mineral resources using contemporary technological innovations. The work's founders, including John Guest and Isaac Wilkinson, brought capital and technical expertise that enabled them to construct blast furnaces and associated facilities that could produce iron on unprecedented scales. The location's advantages included proximity to iron ore deposits, abundant coal for fuel, limestone for flux, and water power for operating machinery. The technological innovations employed at Dowlais included improvements in blast furnace design that increased efficiency while reducing fuel consumption, enabling Welsh ironworks to compete successfully with established English producers. The use of coke instead of charcoal for smelting eliminated dependence on increasingly scarce timber resources while producing higher quality iron that commanded premium prices in domestic and export markets. These technological advantages enabled Welsh ironworks to capture substantial market shares while generating profits that funded further expansion and innovation. The labour requirements of the expanding ironworks created unprecedented demand for workers that attracted migrants from across Wales and beyond, fundamentally altering the demographic composition of previously rural areas. Agricultural workers from Welsh farming communities provided much of the initial labour force, bringing traditional Welsh cultural practices to emerging industrial settlements while adapting to unfamiliar working conditions and social relationships. The concentration of workers in company-built housing created new forms of community organisation that combined traditional Welsh cultural elements with industrial social structures. The Cyfarthfa Ironworks, established by Anthony Bacon in 1765, demonstrated the rapid expansion of Welsh iron production as entrepreneurs competed to exploit the region's mineral advantages. Bacon's works employed innovative production techniques that included the use of steam power for operating blast furnace bellows, reducing dependence on water power while enabling more consistent production schedules. The work's success attracted additional investment that funded expansion into related industries, including coal mining and transportation infrastructure. The social consequences of industrial development in Merthyr Tydfil included the creation of Wales's first industrial town, where traditional rural social relationships gave way to new patterns of class organisation based on industrial employment rather than agricultural tenure. The town's rapid growth from a small market centre to a major industrial settlement created challenges in providing adequate housing, sanitation, and social services for the expanding population. These problems would become characteristic of Welsh industrial development as traditional community structures proved inadequate for managing rapid urbanisation. The development of coal mining in South Wales proceeded alongside iron production, as industrial demand for fuel created profitable markets for Welsh coal that had previously been exploited only for local consumption. The geological advantages of South Welsh coalfields included high-quality deposits that were relatively accessible through surface mining or shallow shafts, reducing extraction costs while providing coal that was particularly suitable for industrial applications. These advantages enabled Welsh coal producers to compete successfully with established English coalfields while developing export markets that would sustain Welsh economic growth for generations. The Blenheim Ironworks, established in 1789, incorporated the most advanced iron-making technology available at the time, while demonstrating the continued expansion of Welsh industrial capacity. The works employed innovations that included improved blast furnace designs and more efficient fuel utilisation that reduced production costs while increasing output quality. The company's integrated approach to iron production included control over coal mines, limestone quarries, and transportation facilities that provided competitive advantages while creating one of the most comprehensive industrial operations in Britain. The workforce development at Blenheim illustrated the social transformations accompanying Welsh industrialisation as traditional craftsmen adapted their skills to industrial production, while new categories of specialised workers emerged to operate complex machinery. The works employed skilled puddlers, furnace keepers, and engine operators whose expertise commanded relatively high wages while requiring extensive training and experience. These skilled workers form the nucleus of emerging industrial communities while maintaining cultural connections to traditional Welsh society. The transportation improvements necessitated by industrial development included the construction of canals, tram roads, and improved highways that connected Welsh industrial centres with domestic and export markets. The Glamorganshire Canal, completed in 1794, provided efficient transportation for iron and coal from Merthyr Tydfil to Cardiff, reducing transportation costs while enabling Welsh producers to compete in distant markets. These infrastructure investments created additional employment opportunities while facilitating the regional economic integration that would characterise Welsh industrial development. The cultural renaissance that accompanied religious revival and early industrialisation reflected growing Welsh confidence in their cultural achievements, while demonstrating successful adaptation of traditional Welsh cultural forms to contemporary circumstances. The revival of Eisteddfod during the 18th century provided institutional frameworks for preserving and developing Welsh literary and musical traditions while creating opportunities for cultural competition that encouraged excellence in traditional Welsh arts. These cultural developments occurred alongside religious and economic transformations, creating comprehensive changes in Welsh society. The revival of bardic traditions during this period involved both preservation of ancient Welsh poetic forms and innovation in themes and techniques that reflected contemporary Welsh experiences. Welsh poets adapted traditional metres and stylistic conventions to address religious, social and political topics that reflected the changing circumstances of Welsh life. This literary development created new forms of Welsh cultural expression while maintaining connection to historical traditions that preserved Welsh cultural identity. The growth of Welsh language publishing during the 18th century provided new opportunities for Welsh cultural development while meeting the practical needs of increasingly literate Welsh communities. Methodist emphasis on religious education created demand for Welsh language books that could provide spiritual instruction and devotional materials for Welsh readers who lacked facility in English. The expansion of Welsh publishing included not only religious works, but also secular literature that demonstrated the continued vitality of Welsh cultural traditions. The establishment of Welsh schools and libraries reflected growing recognition of the importance of education for both spiritual development and practical advancement in increasingly complex economic and social circumstances. Methodist societies established schools that provided basic literacy instruction in Welsh, while introducing students to religious knowledge that would enable them to participate more fully in Methodist spiritual life. These educational initiatives created foundations for broader Welsh intellectual development while preserving Welsh linguistic traditions through formal instruction. As the 19th century dawned, these educational foundations would prove crucial as Wales underwent the most dramatic economic transformation in its history, evolving from a predominantly agricultural society into one of the world's most important industrial regions. The explosive growth of coal mining in South Wales began in earnest around 1800, as technological innovations and expanding markets created unprecedented demand for Welsh coal. The development of steam engines for manufacturing and transportation required high-quality coal that burned efficiently while producing maximum heat output. Welsh steam coal, particularly from the Rhondda valleys, possessed ideal characteristics including low ash content, high calorific value, and clean burning properties that made it superior to most English alternatives. These geological advantages, combined with relatively accessible deposits, positioned Wales to become a dominant force in global coal markets throughout the 19th century. The opening of the Rhondda valleys to large-scale coal extraction transformed previously isolated agricultural communities into bustling industrial centres within a single generation. The first major colliery in the Rhondda Valley opened at Dinas in 1812, followed by systematic development that saw dozens of mines operating by mid-century. Each new colliery required substantial capital investment for sinking shafts, installing winding gear, constructing surface buildings, and developing the transportation infrastructure necessary to move coal to markets. The scale of these investments attracted major English capitalists who possessed the financial resources necessary for such ambitious undertakings. The geological structure of South Welsh coalfields enabled the development of deep mining techniques that accessed coal seams hundreds of feet below ground level. Welsh miners developed expertise in shaft sinking through challenging geological formations, including hard rock and water-bearing strata that required sophisticated engineering solutions. The construction of pit head frames, winding engines, and ventilation systems employed the most advanced mining technology available while creating distinctive industrial landscapes that would characterize Welsh valleys for generations. These technological achievements demonstrated Welsh adaptation to industrial methods while creating new forms of skilled employment that attracted workers from across Britain and Ireland. The expansion of iron production built upon 18th century foundations while incorporating technological innovations that dramatically increased output and improved product quality. The introduction of hot blast furnaces at Welsh ironworks during the 1830s reduced fuel consumption while enabling the use of lower-grade raw materials, significantly reducing production costs and increasing competitiveness in domestic and export markets. Welsh ironmasters like the Guest family at Dowlais invested heavily in these technological improvements while expanding their operations to include coal mining, limestone quarrying, and finished iron products that commanded premium prices. The development of the puddling process at Welsh ironworks enabled the production of wrought iron with superior working properties compared to earlier cast iron products. This technological advance required skilled workers who understood the complex chemical and physical processes involved in converting pig iron into malleable wrought iron suitable for manufacturing applications. Welsh ironworks attracted experienced puddlers from Staffordshire and other English iron-producing regions, while training local workers in these specialised techniques. The concentration of skilled iron workers in South Wales created centres of technical expertise that facilitated continued innovation and expansion. The integration of iron and coal production created synergies that enhanced the efficiency and profitability of both industries while establishing South Wales as a major centre of heavy industry. Ironworks owners acquired coal mines to ensure reliable fuel supplies, while coal companies invested in iron production to create additional markets for their output. This vertical integration enabled Welsh industrial enterprises to control their supply chains while achieving economies of scale that provided competitive advantages over less integrated competitors. The Guest family's operations at Dowlais exemplified this integrated approach, combining iron production with coal mining, limestone quarrying, and transportation facilities. The construction of the Taff-Vale Railway in 1841 revolutionised transportation between South Welsh industrial centres and Cardiff docks, dramatically reducing the cost and time required to move coal and iron products to markets. The railway's construction through the challenging terrain of the Taff Valley required substantial engineering expertise, including the construction of viaducts, tunnels and embankments that demonstrated Welsh adaptation to railway technology. The line's success encouraged additional railway construction that connected industrial valleys with coastal ports while facilitating the movement of raw materials between different production centres. The development of Cardiff as Wales's major port reflected the city's strategic position for exporting South Welsh coal and iron products to domestic and international markets. The construction of the Bute Dock in 1839 provided modern port facilities capable of handling the increasing volume of Welsh exports, while accommodating larger ships that could transport Welsh products to distant markets more efficiently. The Marquess of Bute's investment in dock construction and related infrastructure demonstrated the profitability of Welsh industrial exports, while creating the transportation links necessary for continued expansion. The expansion of steel production during the mid-19th century represented the next phase of Welsh industrial development, as technological innovations enabled the production of steel with superior properties compared to wrought iron. The introduction of the Bessemer process at Welsh works during the 1860s enabled large-scale steel production while reducing costs sufficiently to make steel competitive with iron for many applications. Welsh steel works at locations including Ebbw Vale and Port Talbot incorporated the most advanced steel-making technology while maintaining the integrated approach that had characterised Welsh iron production. Mass migration patterns fundamentally altered Welsh demographic composition as industrial development created employment opportunities that attracted workers from across Britain and Ireland. The population of Glamorgan increased from approximately 70,000 in 1801 to over 300,000 by 1851, with much of this growth concentrated in industrial towns that had barely existed at the century's beginning. Merthyr Tydfil grew from a small market town of 8,000 inhabitants in 1801 to become Wales's largest town with over 46,000 residents by 1851, demonstrating the dramatic pace of industrial urbanisation. Rural to urban migration within Wales brought agricultural workers from Welsh-speaking farming communities to industrial centres, where they encountered unfamiliar working conditions and social relationships while maintaining their cultural traditions and linguistic practices. These internal migrants often settled in distinct neighbourhoods where Welsh language and cultural practices could be preserved while adapting to industrial employment. The concentration of Welsh speakers in particular areas of industrial towns created Welsh-speaking communities that maintained cultural continuity despite fundamental changes in economic and social circumstances. Immigration from England brought skilled workers, managers, and entrepreneurs who possessed technical expertise and capital resources that facilitated Welsh industrial development, while introducing different cultural practices and social expectations. English immigrants often occupied supervisory positions in Welsh industries, while establishing social institutions that reflected their cultural backgrounds. The interaction between Welsh and English populations in industrial settings created new forms of cultural exchange, while sometimes generating tensions regarding language use, religious practices, and social customs. Irish immigration to Wales accelerated during the 1840s as the potato famine drove thousands of Irish families to seek employment in Welsh industrial centres. Irish workers typically accepted lower wages than their Welsh or English counterparts, while bringing different cultural traditions and religious practices that added to the diversity of Welsh industrial communities. The concentration of Irish immigrants in particular neighbourhoods created distinct ethnic communities, while their employment in the most dangerous and poorly paid industrial jobs generated social tensions that occasionally erupted into ethnic conflicts. The development of company towns around major industrial works created new forms of community organisation that combined industrial employment with comprehensive social services provided by employers. The Dowlais Iron Company constructed housing, schools, shops, and recreational facilities for its workforce while maintaining strict control over community life through company regulations and oversight. These paternalistic arrangements provided workers with better living conditions than were available in unplanned industrial settlements, while creating dependencies that limited worker autonomy and bargaining power. The emergence of Welsh political consciousness during the early 19th century reflected growing awareness of distinctive Welsh interests that required political representation and advocacy. The exclusion of Welsh voices from English political institutions became increasingly problematic as industrial development created new economic interests and social problems that required governmental attention. Welsh industrial workers, farmers, and middle-class professionals began to recognise that their interests differed significantly from those of English constituencies, while developing political awareness that would eventually challenge established patterns of political representation. The Rebecca riots of the 1830s and 1840s demonstrated Welsh capacity for organised resistance to policies that threatened traditional ways of life, while revealing the social tensions created by rapid economic change. The riots began as protests against turnpike tolls that imposed financial burdens on Welsh farmers who needed to transport their products to market, but they evolved into broader challenges to English administrative control over Welsh affairs. The rioters adopted female disguises and took the name Rebecca from biblical references while developing sophisticated organisational methods that enabled coordinated action across wide geographical areas. The participants in the Rebecca riots included Welsh farmers, agricultural labourers, and craftsmen who faced economic pressures created by industrial development and administrative changes imposed by English authorities. The rioters destroyed toll gates, attacked workhouses, and intimidated officials who implemented unpopular policies while maintaining discipline that avoided the random violence that characterised some contemporary English protests. Their actions reflected traditional Welsh concepts of community justice, while demonstrating organisational capabilities that suggested potential for more comprehensive political action. The government response to the Rebecca riots included military intervention and legal prosecutions that suppressed immediate resistance while failing to address the underlying grievances that had motivated the protests. The deployment of troops and special constables demonstrated English determination to maintain administrative control over Wales, while the appointment of a royal commission to investigate the riots' causes acknowledged that legitimate grievances required attention. The Commission's report recommended administrative reforms that address some Welsh concerns while maintaining English political control over Welsh affairs. The Chartist movement attracted substantial Welsh support during the 1830s and 1840s as industrial workers and middle-class reformers embraced demands for democratic political representation that would enable Welsh communities to influence governmental policies affecting their interests. Welsh Chartists organised massive demonstrations, petition campaigns, and political education activities that demonstrated growing Welsh political awareness, while connecting local Welsh grievances with broader democratic movements throughout Britain. The movement's emphasis on universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and annual parliaments appealed to Welsh communities that had been excluded from political participation. The Newport Rising of 1839 represented the most dramatic expression of Welsh Chartist militancy, as thousands of protesters marched on the town demanding the release of imprisoned Chartist leaders while challenging governmental authority through coordinated mass action. The march, led by John Frost, Zephaniah Williams and William Jones, attracted participants from across the South Wales valleys who were willing to risk imprisonment or death for democratic principles. The confrontation with troops at the Westgate Hotel resulted in approximately 20 deaths, while demonstrating both Welsh commitment to democratic reform and the government's determination to suppress challenges to established authority. The aftermath of the Newport Rising included extensive legal prosecutions that resulted in death sentences for the movement's leaders, later commuted to transportation, while hundreds of participants faced imprisonment or other penalties. The government's harsh response temporarily suppressed Welsh Chartist activity, while creating martyrs whose sufferings strengthened Welsh commitment to democratic reform. The Rising's failure demonstrated the limitations of direct confrontation with governmental authority, while providing valuable lessons regarding the organisation of political opposition that would influence subsequent Welsh political movements. The development of liberal politics in Wales during the mid-19th century provided constitutional channels for expressing Welsh political aspirations, while connecting Welsh constituencies with broader British liberal movements that supported democratic reform, free trade and religious liberty. Welsh liberal politicians emerged from nonconformist religious communities that had developed organisational skills and political awareness through their struggles for religious equality and educational opportunities. These religious foundations provided Welsh liberalism with distinctive characteristics that emphasised moral reform alongside political and economic changes. The Education Act of 1870 created new opportunities for Welsh political mobilisation as communities organised to establish school boards while debating the role of Welsh language and culture in educational provision. Welsh liberal politicians advocated for educational policies that would respect Welsh cultural traditions while providing Welsh children with the knowledge and skills necessary for advancement in industrial society. The debates surrounding educational policy revealed tensions between Welsh cultural preservation and practical educational needs that would continue to influence Welsh political discourse. The emergence of David Lloyd George as a major figure in Welsh and British politics demonstrated the potential for Welsh politicians to achieve national prominence while maintaining their commitment to distinctive Welsh interests and values. Born in Manchester to Welsh parents and raised in Llanystumdwy by his uncle, Lloyd George combined intimate knowledge of Welsh society with exceptional oratorical abilities and political instincts that enabled him to build coalitions supporting progressive reform. His early legal career defending Welsh farmers against English landlords established his reputation as a champion of Welsh interests, while developing his understanding of the legal and political systems he would later help reform. Lloyd George's election to Parliament in 1890 as Liberal member for Caernarfon boroughs marked the beginning of a political career that would transform both Welsh politics and British government while demonstrating Welsh capacity for national leadership. His parliamentary speeches combined passionate advocacy for Welsh interests with broader liberal principles that appealed to progressive constituencies throughout Britain. His opposition to the Boer War reflected Welsh nonconformist moral concerns, while establishing his credentials as an independent political voice, willing to challenge governmental policies he considered unjust. The campaign for Welsh disestablishment became a central focus of Welsh liberal politics, as nonconformist communities sought to end the privileged position of the Anglican Church in Wales, while achieving religious equality for Protestant dissenters who constituted the majority of Welsh churchgoers. The disestablishment movement combined religious motivations with political arguments that challenged the legitimacy of English ecclesiastical control over Welsh religious affairs. Welsh liberal politicians argued that disestablishment would enable Welsh religious communities to develop according to their own traditions and needs, while eliminating subsidies that supported a minority church at the expense of the Welsh majority. The tithe wars of the 1880s demonstrated Welsh determination to challenge Anglican privilege through organised resistance to church taxes that supported clergy who served predominantly English congregations. Welsh farmers refused to pay tithes, while organised protests disrupted tithe collection procedures, creating confrontations that required police intervention while generating publicity for the disestablishment cause. These conflicts reveal the depth of Welsh religious grievances while demonstrating organisational capabilities that could be applied to broader political objectives. Educational and cultural developments during the 19th century reflected growing Welsh confidence in their intellectual capabilities, while demonstrating successful adaptation of Welsh cultural traditions to contemporary educational and scholarly standards. The establishment of teacher training colleges at Bangor and Swansea provided Welsh communities with professionally trained teachers who could provide quality education while maintaining sensitivity to Welsh cultural circumstances. These institutions produced educators who understood both contemporary pedagogical methods and Welsh cultural traditions, enabling them to develop educational approaches that respected Welsh identity while preparing students for participation in industrial society. The founding of the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth in 1872 represented the culmination of Welsh educational aspirations, while demonstrating community commitment to higher education that could serve Welsh needs and interests. The college's establishment required extensive fundraising campaigns that attracted support from Welsh communities throughout the world, including Welsh immigrants in America and Australia who maintained emotional connections to their homeland. The success of these fundraising efforts demonstrated the breadth of Welsh support for educational advancement, while creating the first Welsh institution of higher education. The development of the Welsh intermediate education system during the 1880s provided secondary educational opportunities that had previously been available only to wealthy families who could afford private schooling. The Welsh Intermediate Education Act of 1889 established county schools that offered academic education, leading to university entrance while maintaining sensitivity to Welsh cultural circumstances. These schools produced educated Welsh individuals who could pursue professional careers while maintaining their Welsh identity and cultural commitments. The establishment of the University of Wales in 1893 created a federal university structure that coordinated higher education throughout Wales, while enabling the development of specialised institutions that could serve different regions and educational needs. The university's federal structure enabled the incorporation of existing colleges while facilitating the establishment of additional institutions that could expand Welsh higher educational capacity. This organisational innovation demonstrated Welsh ability to develop educational institutions that met international standards while serving distinctive Welsh needs and circumstances. The growth of Welsh nationalism during the late 19th century reflected increasing awareness of Welsh cultural distinctiveness and political interests that required recognition and protection within the broader British political system. Welsh nationalist sentiment drew upon romantic literary movements that celebrated Welsh historical achievements while addressing contemporary concerns about cultural preservation and political representation. The establishment of cultural organisations like Cymdeithas Iaith Gymraeg demonstrated Welsh determination to preserve their linguistic heritage while adapting to modern circumstances. The revival of the National Eisteddfod as an annual cultural festival provided institutional frameworks for celebrating Welsh literary and musical achievements while encouraging continued cultural development that maintained connection to historical traditions. The Eisteddfod's competitive structure encouraged excellence in Welsh poetry, music and oratory, while creating opportunities for Welsh cultural figures to achieve recognition and influence. These cultural celebrations demonstrated Welsh pride in their achievements, while providing inspiration for continued cultural development. The development of Welsh language journalism during the 19th century provided new opportunities for Welsh cultural expression, while creating forums for political discussion and cultural debate that strengthened Welsh intellectual life. Welsh newspapers like Y Cymro and Banerac am Zeraw Cymru provided Welsh readers with news and commentary that reflected Welsh perspectives on contemporary events, while encouraging discussion of issues that affected Welsh communities. The success of Welsh language publications demonstrated the continued vitality of Welsh culture, while providing practical evidence of Welsh intellectual capabilities. The emergence of Welsh historical scholarship during the late 19th century provided intellectual foundations that would prove crucial as Wales entered the 20th century, facing unprecedented challenges to its social fabric and cultural identity. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 shattered the industrial prosperity and social stability that had characterised late Victorian Wales, transforming Welsh society through military service, economic disruption, and cultural change that would reshape Welsh identity for generations. The war's impact extended far beyond the immediate military casualties, fundamentally altering the relationship between Welsh communities and the British state, while accelerating social changes that had been developing throughout the industrial period. Welsh recruitment for military service proceeded with remarkable enthusiasm during the war's early months, as communities across Wales responded to calls for volunteers with patriotic fervour that reflected both loyalty to Britain and confidence in Welsh martial traditions. The formation of specifically Welsh military units, including the Welsh Guards and various territorial battalions, provided frameworks for maintaining Welsh cultural identity within British military structures, while demonstrating Welsh commitment to the imperial cause. These Welsh units attracted volunteers from mining communities, agricultural areas, and industrial towns who brought their local loyalties and cultural practices into military service. The 38th Welsh Division represented the largest specifically Welsh military formation, comprising territorial and volunteer battalions drawn from communities throughout Wales. The division's composition reflected the social diversity of early 20th century Wales, including miners from the South Wales valleys, farmers from rural counties, and clerks from expanding commercial centres. The men who joined these battalions brought with them the chapel-going respectability, political awareness, and cultural pride that had characterised Welsh society during the previous century, creating military units with distinctive cultural characteristics that set them apart from English formations. The Battle of Mametz Wood in July 1916 became the defining military experience for Welsh forces during the First World War, as the 38th Welsh Division faced the challenge of capturing heavily fortified German positions during the Somme offensive. The assault began on July 7th, with preliminary bombardments that failed to eliminate German machine gun positions concealed within the dense woodland. Welsh battalions advanced across open ground under withering fire that decimated their ranks, while demonstrating the courage and determination that had characterised Welsh military traditions throughout history. The fighting within Mametz Wood itself required close-quarter combat through tangled undergrowth and fallen trees that negated the advantages of artillery support while favouring defenders who knew the terrain. Welsh soldiers fought with bayonets and grenades through a nightmare landscape of shattered trees, shell craters, and decomposing bodies from earlier attacks. The division's eventual capture of the wood came at enormous cost, with casualties exceeding 4,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during 5 days of continuous fighting that demonstrated both Welsh military capabilities and the devastating nature of modern warfare. The casualties sustained at Mametz Wood and other Western Front battles devastated Welsh communities that had contributed disproportionate numbers of volunteers relative to their population. Mining villages in the Rhondda, Aberdare and other valleys lost entire generations of young men whose deaths eliminated not only individual lives, but also the cultural continuity that had sustained Welsh-speaking communities. The war memorials erected in virtually every Welsh town and village after 1918 testified to losses that affected every family while creating permanent reminders of sacrifice that would influence Welsh attitudes toward war and peace for decades. The economic disruption caused by wartime mobilisation transformed Welsh industrial production, while creating new challenges for communities that had depended on export markets disrupted by submarine warfare and continental conflict. The South Wales coalfields experienced unprecedented demand for coal needed to fuel British and Allied war efforts, leading to intensive extraction that strained both human resources and mining infrastructure. The conscription of experienced miners for military service created labour shortages that required the employment of women, elderly workers, and prisoners of war in roles previously reserved for skilled male miners. The expansion of munitions production in Wales created new industrial opportunities while transforming the economic foundations of communities that had previously depended on coal mining and iron production. The establishment of munition factories at locations including Bridgend, Pembrey and Hirvaun provided employment for thousands of workers while introducing new technologies and production methods that would influence post-war industrial development. These facilities employed substantial numbers of women who gained industrial experience and economic independence that challenged traditional gender roles within Welsh society. Agricultural production in Wales faced competing demands from military recruitment and increased food production requirements that strained farming communities already experiencing long-term demographic decline. The conscription of farm workers for military service reduced available labour, while government pressure for increased food production required more intensive cultivation of marginal lands. Welsh farmers adapted by employing women, elderly workers, and prisoners of war while mechanising operations that had previously depended on manual labour. The Welsh language experienced significant decline during the war years as military service, industrial employment, and social disruption weakened the community structures that had sustained Welsh-speaking culture. Young Welsh speakers who survived military service often returned to communities where English had become more prevalent due to wartime social changes and economic pressures. The loss of Welsh-speaking young men through military casualties eliminated potential cultural leaders, while the social disruption of wartime weakened traditional institutions that had preserved Welsh linguistic traditions. The post-war economic depression that began in the early 1920s devastated Welsh industrial communities as international demand for Welsh coal and steel declined, while technological changes reduced the competitive advantages that had sustained Welsh heavy industry. The collapse of export markets, particularly for steam coal previously used by naval and merchant vessels converting to oil fuel, eliminated thousands of jobs in mining communities that had few alternative sources of employment. The closure of collieries throughout South Wales created unemployment rates exceeding 40% in some valleys, while forcing mass emigration from communities that had experienced rapid growth during the industrial expansion of the previous century. The general strike of 1926 demonstrated both the solidarity of Welsh industrial workers and the limitations of traditional trade union strategies in confronting fundamental economic changes that threatened the viability of Welsh heavy industry. Welsh miners participated enthusiastically in the strike while maintaining discipline and community support that reflected the social cohesion developed through decades of industrial struggle. However, the strike's failure to achieve its objectives revealed the inadequacy of traditional industrial action in addressing structural economic problems that required comprehensive economic restructuring rather than wage negotiations. The interwar period witnessed the emergence of new forms of Welsh political consciousness as communities devastated by industrial decline sought alternative approaches to economic development and cultural preservation. The establishment of Pled Cymru in 1925 provided institutional expression for Welsh nationalist sentiment that combined cultural preservation objectives with political autonomy goals designed to enable Welsh communities to control their own economic and social development. The party's founding members included intellectuals, writers, and religious leaders who possessed sophisticated understanding of Welsh cultural traditions, while recognising the need for political action to preserve Welsh identity against assimilationist pressures. Saunders Lewis emerged as the most significant intellectual leader of early Welsh nationalism through his scholarly work and political activism that combined rigorous analysis of Welsh cultural achievements with passionate advocacy for Welsh political autonomy. Lewis's background as a literary scholar and critic provided him with intimate knowledge of Welsh cultural traditions, while his political writings articulated sophisticated arguments for Welsh self-government that went beyond romantic nationalism to address practical questions of economic development and social organisation. His conversion to Catholicism and adoption of conservative social positions distinguished him from the liberal Protestant traditions that had dominated Welsh politics, while creating intellectual frameworks that connected Welsh nationalism with broader European political movements. The burning of the RAF bombing school at Pennyberth in 1936 represented the most dramatic early action by Welsh nationalists, while demonstrating their commitment to non-violent resistance methods that reflected both principled opposition to violence and tactical recognition of Welsh political weakness. Lewis, along with Lewis Valentine and D.J. Williams, planned and executed the arson attack against facilities that they argued threatened Welsh cultural survival by militarising the Llyn Peninsula's Welsh-speaking communities. Their subsequent surrender to police and willingness to accept imprisonment demonstrated disciplined political commitment while generating publicity for Welsh nationalist arguments that had previously received limited attention. The trial and imprisonment of the Pennyberth Three created the first Welsh nationalist martyrs of the modern period, while establishing precedents for principled resistance to governmental policies that threatened Welsh cultural survival. The defendants' insistence on conducting their trial in Welsh, despite court refusal to provide translation services, highlighted language rights issues, while their dignified acceptance of imprisonment demonstrated moral authority that commanded respect even from political opponents. Their actions inspired a generation of Welsh nationalist activists, while establishing non-violent resistance as the preferred strategy for Welsh political action. The Second World War's impact on Wales proved less devastating than the 1914 to 1918 conflict, but created different forms of social disruption through evacuation programs, military installations, and industrial mobilisation that accelerated existing trends toward Anglicisation and cultural change. The evacuation of English children to rural Welsh areas introduced English-speaking populations to previously Welsh-speaking communities, while the establishment of military bases and training facilities brought substantial numbers of English personnel to Wales. These demographic changes weakened Welsh-speaking communities while creating social tensions between traditional Welsh culture and external influences. The mobilisation of Welsh industry for wartime production provided temporary economic relief for communities that had suffered prolonged unemployment during the interwar depression, while demonstrating Welsh industrial capabilities that would influence post-war economic planning. The expansion of steel production, munitions manufacturing and aircraft assembly created employment opportunities while introducing new technologies and production methods that modernised Welsh industrial capacity. However, this wartime prosperity depended on government contracts and strategic necessities that would disappear with the return of peace. The establishment of the welfare state during the 1940s provided Welsh communities with social services and economic security that had been lacking during the industrial depression, while creating new relationships between Welsh society and the British state. The National Health Service, comprehensive education system, and social security programs addressed long-standing Welsh concerns about poverty, healthcare, and educational opportunity, while reducing the economic insecurity that had characterised industrial communities. These improvements in living standards and social services strengthened Welsh support for the British state, while reducing some of the grievances that had motivated Welsh nationalist activism. The post-war deindustrialisation of Wales began during the 1950s as technological changes and international competition reduced demand for Welsh coal and steel, while government policies encouraged industrial diversification away from traditional heavy industries. The closure of collieries throughout South Wales accelerated during the 1960s and 1970s as oil and natural gas replaced coal for domestic and industrial heating, while more efficient foreign steel producers captured markets previously dominated by Welsh works. These closures eliminated thousands of jobs in communities that had few alternative sources of employment, while destroying the social structures that had sustained Welsh industrial culture. The Aberfan disaster of October 21, 1966 became a defining tragedy of Welsh industrial decline, as the collapse of a coal waste tip killed 144 people, including 116 children at Pantglas Junior School. The disaster resulted from decades of unsafe waste disposal practices by the National Coal Board, while inadequate safety oversight allowed dangerous conditions to develop despite community warnings about the tip's instability. The tragedy highlighted the human costs of industrial decline, while demonstrating the continued vulnerability of Welsh communities to decisions made by distant authorities who lacked understanding of local conditions. The community response to the Aberfan disaster demonstrated Welsh social solidarity, while revealing tensions between local needs and external authority that would influence subsequent Welsh political development. The dignified grief of bereaved families and their demands for accountability created moral authority that commanded national attention, while their struggles to obtain adequate compensation revealed the limitations of existing political structures for protecting Welsh community interests. The disaster became a symbol of Welsh vulnerability to external decisions, while strengthening arguments for greater Welsh control over policies affecting Welsh communities. The decline of traditional industries created opportunities for developing new forms of economic activity that could provide employment while preserving Welsh cultural identity. The growth of tourism during the 1960s and 1970s capitalised on Wales's natural beauty and cultural heritage, while creating service sector jobs that could replace industrial employment. The development of attractions including heritage centres, cultural festivals, and outdoor recreation facilities demonstrated Welsh ability to adapt their cultural resources to contemporary economic needs, while preserving traditions that had sustained Welsh identity throughout centuries of change. The establishment of the Welsh Development Agency in 1976 represented recognition that Welsh economic problems required specialised attention and coordinated development strategies that could address the particular challenges facing post-industrial Welsh communities. The agency's programmes attracted foreign investment, while supporting Indigenous Welsh businesses through financial assistance and technical support that enabled them to compete in national and international markets. These initiatives achieved considerable success in diversifying the Welsh economy while creating employment opportunities that reduced dependence on traditional heavy industries. The revival of Welsh language consciousness during the 1960s and 1970s reflected growing awareness that cultural preservation required active protection against assimilationist pressures that threatened Welsh linguistic survival. The formation of Cymdeithas Iaith Gymraeg in 1962 provided organisational frameworks for language rights campaigns that employed non-violent direct action methods to demand official recognition and practical support for Welsh language use. The Society's campaigns for Welsh language television programming, bilingual road signs, and Welsh medium education achieved significant successes while demonstrating the effectiveness of disciplined political action in advancing Welsh cultural objectives. The campaign for Welsh language television programming culminated in Gwynfor Evans's threat to fast to death unless the Conservative government honoured its commitment to establish a Welsh language television channel. Evans's moral authority as president of Pled Cymru and his willingness to sacrifice his life for Welsh cultural survival created irresistible pressure that forced the government to establish S4C in 1982. The channel's success in providing high-quality Welsh language programming demonstrated the viability of Welsh language media, while creating employment opportunities for Welsh speakers and cultural content that strengthened Welsh identity. The development of Welsh medium education expanded dramatically during the 1970s and 1980s as parents demanded educational opportunities that would enable their children to become fluent Welsh speakers while receiving quality education that prepared them for contemporary career opportunities. The establishment of Welsh medium primary schools in predominantly English-speaking areas demonstrated parental commitment to Welsh language transmission, while the expansion of Welsh medium secondary education provided pathways for continued Welsh language development through adolescence. These educational developments created new generations of Welsh speakers, while demonstrating that bilingual education could enhance rather than limit educational achievement. The miners' strike of 1984 to 1985 represented the final confrontation between traditional Welsh industrial communities and government policies designed to eliminate uneconomical coal mining while demonstrating both the solidarity and ultimate powerlessness of Welsh industrial workers. Welsh mining communities supported the strike with remarkable unanimity, while maintaining discipline and community cohesion that reflected decades of collective struggle. However, the strike's failure and the subsequent closure of most Welsh collieries eliminated the industrial base that had sustained Welsh working-class culture, while forcing fundamental reassessment of Welsh economic and social identity. The closure of the last deep coal mine in Wales at Tower Colliery in 2008 marked the end of an industrial era that had defined Welsh identity for 2 centuries, while symbolising the comprehensive economic transformation that had occurred since the 1980s. The mine's final years under worker ownership demonstrated alternative approaches to industrial management, while its closure eliminated the last connection to the coal mining industry that had created modern Welsh industrial society. The transformation of former mining areas into heritage sites and tourist attractions reflected Welsh adaptation to post-industrial economic realities while preserving memory of industrial achievements. The campaign for Welsh political devolution gained momentum during the 1970s as communities devastated by deindustrialisation sought greater control over policies affecting Welsh economic and social development. The establishment of the Wales Office in 1964 had provided administrative recognition of Welsh distinctiveness, while the appointment of a Secretary of State for Wales created cabinet-level representation for Welsh interests. However, these administrative arrangements provided only limited influence over policies determined by Westminster, while Welsh communities faced problems that required comprehensive solutions adapted to Welsh circumstances. The first devolution referendum in 1979 resulted in overwhelming defeat for proposals to establish a Welsh Assembly, as voters rejected plans that appeared to offer limited powers while creating additional layers of government bureaucracy. The referendum's failure reflected both scepticism about the proposed Assembly's effectiveness and concerns about the costs and complexity of new governmental structures. The decisive defeat, with only 20% support for devolution, demonstrated that Welsh political autonomy required more compelling justification and better designed institutional arrangements to gain popular acceptance. The transformation of Welsh society during the 1980s and 1990s created new conditions that made devolution more attractive as communities sought political tools for managing economic transition while preserving cultural identity. The decline of traditional industries eliminated the economic foundations of previous Welsh society, while the growth of service industries, higher education, and cultural activities created new forms of Welsh identity that required political expression. The success of Welsh language revival and cultural development demonstrated Welsh capacity for self-directed change while generating confidence that political autonomy could enhance rather than threaten Welsh achievements. The election of the Labour government in 1997 created opportunities for implementing devolution proposals that had been refined through 2 decades of political debate and constitutional analysis. The second devolution referendum on September 18, 1997, produced narrow approval for establishing a National Assembly for Wales, with 50.3% support reflecting continued scepticism balanced by recognition that devolution offered opportunities for addressing Welsh problems through Welsh solutions. The narrow margin of victory demonstrated that Welsh opinion remained divided, while the positive result provided sufficient mandate for proceeding with constitutional change. The establishment of the National Assembly for Wales in 1999 created the first Welsh political institution with democratic legitimacy since the medieval period, while providing frameworks for developing distinctively Welsh approaches to governance and policy making. The Assembly's initial powers, limited to secondary legislation and administrative oversight, disappointed some supporters who had hoped for more substantial autonomy while providing sufficient authority to demonstrate Welsh governmental capabilities. The Assembly's location in Cardiff Bay symbolised Welsh political renewal, while its bilingual proceedings demonstrated commitment to Welsh cultural values within modern democratic frameworks. The development of Assembly powers through successive Government of Wales Acts expanded Welsh political autonomy while demonstrating growing confidence in Welsh governmental capabilities. The 2006 Act provided limited primary legislative powers, while the 2011 referendum approved full legislative powers over devolved subjects, enabling the Assembly to develop comprehensive Welsh policies in areas including health, education, and economic development. These expansions reflected both Welsh political maturity and Westminster recognition that effective governance required substantial autonomy for addressing distinctive Welsh circumstances. The evolution of the Assembly into the Senedd Cymru in 2020 reflected growing Welsh political confidence, while symbolising the maturation of Welsh democratic institutions. The name change emphasised the institution's legislative rather than merely administrative character, while the expansion to 60 members provided additional capacity for detailed policy development and democratic oversight. These changes demonstrated Welsh political development while maintaining the collaborative rather than adversarial approach that had characterised Welsh political culture since devolution. Contemporary Welsh identity reflects successful adaptation to post-industrial economic realities while maintaining cultural distinctiveness that connects modern Wales with historical traditions. The growth of Welsh medium education has created new generations of bilingual Welsh speakers who can participate fully in contemporary economic and cultural life while maintaining their linguistic heritage. The success of Welsh cultural industries, including television production, music and literature, demonstrates the continued vitality of Welsh creativity while providing economic opportunities that support cultural development. The development of modern Welsh economic strategy emphasises knowledge-based industries, sustainable development, and cultural tourism that capitalise on Welsh advantages while addressing environmental and social challenges. The growth of universities and research institutions has created centres of innovation, while the development of renewable energy industries positions Wales as a leader in sustainable technology. These economic developments provide employment opportunities while maintaining Welsh commitment to environmental protection and social justice that reflects traditional Welsh values adapted to contemporary circumstances. The future of Wales depends on maintaining the cultural confidence and political maturity that has enabled successful navigation of industrial decline, cultural revival, and political devolution, while addressing contemporary challenges including climate change, economic inequality, and demographic change. The establishment of democratic Welsh institutions provides frameworks for addressing these challenges, while the revival of Welsh cultural confidence creates foundations for continued development that honours Welsh traditions while embracing necessary changes. Wales today represents a successful example of how small nations can maintain their distinctive identity while adapting to contemporary realities, demonstrating that cultural preservation and modernisation can be complementary rather than conflicting objectives. The story of Wales, from ancient Celtic tribes to modern democratic nation, illustrates the resilience of cultural identity and the possibility of peaceful political evolution that respects both tradition and progress. Through conquest and resistance, industrial transformation and cultural revival, economic decline and political renewal, Wales has maintained its distinctive character while adapting to changing circumstances that have tested but not destroyed the bonds connecting contemporary Welsh communities with their historical heritage. This continuity within change represents Wales's greatest achievement and its most valuable contribution to understanding how nations can preserve their identity while embracing the future.